The stars bled out one by one as three figures stumbled through the New Mexico scrubland. Dawn approached like a threat. Elena pressed her hand against the torn fabric on Mika's shoulder, feeling the warmth of fresh blood seeping through. Behind them, Nara kept turning her breath, coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the certainty that horses would come thundering over that ridge. They had run for 2 nights and most of a day. The labor camp lay somewhere behind them, 18 miles or maybe 20, a place where promises of fair wages had dissolved into locked doors and hands that took what they wanted. Elena had killed the guard who tried to stop them. Not with a weapon, just her hands and a rock, and the kind of rage that makes killing feel like breathing. She could still feel his blood cooling on her knuckles. The homestead appeared as the sun crested the eastern hills. A single structure, weathered wood that had gone silver under decades of unforgiving sky, stood beside a creek bed that looked more like a scar in the earth than a source of water. Smoke rose from the chimney. A man emerged from the barn, carrying an axe, and Elena's hand moved to the knife at her belt. Mika stumbled. Her knee gave out completely this time, and she went down hard in the dust. Nara caught her before her face hit the ground, but the cry that escaped Mika's throat cut through the morning air like a blade. The man with the axe turned. His eyes found them across the open ground. Elena positioned herself between her sisters and this stranger. The knife came free of its sheath. She had maybe 3 seconds before blood loss made her clumsy, before Mika passed out entirely, before whatever mercy or cruelty lived in this man's heart revealed itself. He set the axe down, slowly, both hands visible. Then he walked to the well and drew up a bucket of water. Instead of approaching them, he carried it to the exact midpoint between his door and where they stood frozen in their wretched tableau. He set the bucket down, took 5 deliberate steps backward, opened both palms to the sky. The door to his home stood open. Elena could see inside to the single room, shadowed and cool. She noticed the latch on the door frame turned outward, a detail that made no sense until she understood what it meant. This man had given them the power to lock him out. Nara touched Elena's elbow. Her youngest sister's voice came out steady despite everything that had tried to break it in the past 6 weeks. Trust him or die in the sun. Not much of a choice, is it? Elena looked at the man. His face carried the kind of lines that came from grief, not meanness. His clothes were clean but mended in multiple places. No gun on his hip, though she could see a rifle propped inside the doorway where any sane person in this territory would keep one. Everything about his posture suggested patience, and patience was not a quality she associated with men who meant harm. She shifted her weight. Mika leaned heavily against her, unconscious now, or close to it. The man still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He simply stood there in the morning light, with his hands open and his door unlocked, waiting for them to choose. Elena chose. The bucket's water tasted like mineral and rust and salvation. Nara drank first, then helped Mika sip slowly while Elena watched the man for any sign that his hospitality came with conditions. He backed up another step when Elena lifted Mika into her arms, giving them even more space to cross that threshold. Inside, the heat of the day hadn't yet penetrated the thick adobe walls. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something else, something indefinably male, but not threatening. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with canned goods and a few books whose spines had faded beyond reading. Everything worn but maintained the home of someone who lived alone and had learned to care for what little he owned. The man gestured to the bed. Elena laid Mika down carefully, noting how the stranger immediately moved to the opposite side of the room, maintaining that careful distance. He opened a small cabinet and removed clean cloth, a brown bottle of what had to be alcohol, in a basin. These he set on the table. Elena studied the supplies, looked at the man. He tilted his head toward the items, a silent offering. She understood he was asking permission to approach, to help, to touch her injured sister. The realization landed in her chest like something heavy and unexpected. When was the last time a man asked permission? She nodded once. The man moved forward slowly, his movements telegraphed and careful. He knelt beside the bed, bringing his eyes level with Mika's face rather than looming over her. His hands were calloused but clean, and when he peeled back the blood-soaked fabric on Mika's shoulder, his touch was so gentle that Mika didn't even flinch in her half-conscious state. The wound looked worse in the light, a gash 4 inches long where a guard's knife had opened the skin during their escape. It needed stitches, probably had needed them for the past 30 hours, An infection had already started its creeping work at the edges. The man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply poured warm water from a kettle into the basin and began cleaning the wound with a methodical precision that spoke of experience. Nara translated before Elena could form the words. Your sister will need medicine. The wound is angry. The man paused, looked up at Nara with something like surprise. You speak English. Better than my sisters. Our father believed we should know both languages. He said survival meant understanding the world that wanted to erase us. The man's expression shifted, something passing behind his eyes that might have been respect or recognition. He returned his attention to Mika's shoulder, applying the alcohol in careful dabs. Mika jerked awake with a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to the knife that wasn't there anymore. The man froze immediately, raising his hand slightly, giving her space to orient herself. Nara knelt beside the bed and spoke rapid Apache, her voice soothing. Mika's eyes focused, slowly moving from the stranger to her sisters to the unfamiliar room. Her body remained tensed for flight, even as exhaustion tried to drag her back under. I am going to bandage this. The man's voice was quiet, almost monotone. It will hurt. You can tell me to stop at any time. Mika's eyes found Elena. The eldest sister nodded. Mika closed her eyes and turned her face toward the wall, permission granted through resignation more than trust. The man worked quite quickly after that, wrapping the wound with the clean cloth in layers that would hold but not constrict. When he finished, he stood and moved to the door. There is a root cellar beneath the house. He directed this at Elena. The entrance is outside around the east wall. Inside you will find potatoes, onions, dried meat. Take what you need. The well water is clean. The latch on that door works from inside. You can lock me out whenever you choose. Elena processed each statement, looking for the trap, the condition, the demand that would come next. Nothing followed. The man simply moved toward the door. What is your name? Nara asked before he could leave. Ethan Wade. Why are you helping us? Because you need help. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by morning sun. And because no one should have to run like you three have been running. How do you know we have been running? Because I walked before. In mirrors. He left, then pulling the door closed behind him, but not latching it. Elena heard his boots on the porch boards, then the sound of an axe biting into wood. The rhythm was steady and unhurried, the sound of a man going about his work, as if three desperate strangers had not just invaded his home and possibly his peace. Nara crossed to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtain. He is splitting wood. Just splitting wood like this is any other morning. Elena joined her. They watched Ethan Wade work his movements, efficient and practiced. No glances toward the house to check on them. No aggressive posturing. He simply existed in his own space, allowing them to exist in his, the boundaries between them maintained by something more reliable than locked doors. I do not trust this. Elena kept her voice low, even though Wade was too far away to hear. Men do not help without wanting something. Maybe he already got what he wanted. Nara's tone carried an edge of something that might have been hope or might have been naivety. Elena could not tell which. Maybe he wanted to not be alone in his grief. What grief? Look at this place. Nara gestured around the room. There are dishes for 4 people, but only one sleeps here. There are small dresses in that trunk by the wall. I saw them when he opened it for the bandages. A woman's shawl hanging on the peg by the door. This was a family's home. Now it is one man's tomb. Elena looked again at the room's details. Nara was right. The signs were everywhere once you knew to look. The second smaller bed pushed against the wall and unused. The table set for one, though it had been built for more. Even the way the light fell through the windows seemed calibrated for inhabitants who no longer cast shadows. On the bed, Mika stirred and opened her eyes. Her voice came out rough with pain and exhaustion. Where are we? Somewhere between hell and something else. Elena returned to her side. A man named Ethan Wade took us in. He cleaned your wound, gave us his bed. Mika tried to sit up, failed. Her face went gray with the effort. They will find us. Voss will send men. He will not let us go, not after what we cost him, not after what you did to Marcus. The name landed like a stone in still water. Marcus Hale, the guard who had learned that Apache women bled the same red as any other woman when you opened their throats. Elena had made certain he understood that truth in the seconds before he stopped understanding anything at all. Let them come. Elena's hand went to the knife at her belt, an unconscious gesture that had become habit. We will be gone before they arrive. But Nara was still at the window watching Wade work. Will we, though? Or will we stay until Mika can walk without collapsing? Until we know where to run next? Until we understand if this strange man, with his careful distance and his open door, is the kind of anomaly that could change everything. Elena wanted to say they would leave at nightfall, wanted to trust nothing and no one because trust had proven itself a luxury they could not afford. But Mika's wound was infected, and Nara was right about having nowhere else to go. The labor camp was behind them. The reservation was 3 days north and probably no safer. This homestead with its grieving occupant and its unlocked door represented the only pause button in a chase that had been playing at double speed since they fled. We stay tonight. Alina made it sound like a tactical decision rather than an admission of desperate need. Tomorrow we see if this hospitality has a price. The day crawled forward. Wade continued his work outside, never coming to the door, never checking on them. Around noon, Alina ventured out to the root cellar he had mentioned. She found it exactly where he said, stocked with provisions that suggested a man who planned for hard winters and harder times. She took potatoes and dried venison, carrying them back to the house where Nara had managed to coax the fire in the hearth into something useful. They ate in silence, the three of them clustered near the bed where Mika dozed fitfully. The food tasted better than anything they had eaten in 6 weeks, simple and clean, and theirs by invitation rather than theft. That small dignity seemed enormous in its implications. Evening approached. Wade finally returned to the house as the sun balanced on the western ridgeline. He paused at the threshold, waiting for acknowledgement before entering his own home. Elena found herself nodding permission, this small inversion of power, both absurd and strangely moving. I have been thinking about your situation. Wade moved to the table but did not sit. From the description you gave me, those men who had an illegal operation. Debt bondage is against federal law, has been since '70. If you wanted to press charges, Alina cut him off with a sound that was half laugh, half something colder. You think law applies to us, to Apache women with no proof, no witnesses, who will speak no money for lawyers. You think any court in this territory will hear our word against white men who own land and pay taxes? Wade was quiet for a moment. Then, you are right. I apologize for the suggestion. It was naive. The admission surprised her. Men in her experience did not apologize for being wrong, did not acknowledge the limitations of systems that served them. She studied him more carefully, trying to reconcile his actions with the category of person she had spent her life learning to fear. If they come here looking for us, Nara said, what will you do? Wade met her gaze directly. Tell them I have seen no one. And then I will make sure they leave, with violence, if necessary. You would fight for strangers. Alina heard the skepticism in her own voice. Risk your life for 3 women you met this morning. Wade looked toward the window where the last light was failing. I have spent 3 years doing nothing of consequence. 3 years watching grass grow and seasons turn, and my own reflection become something I barely recognize. Maybe this is the first thing that has mattered since I buried my family. Maybe helping you matters more than whatever easy peace I had convinced myself was enough. The silence that followed carried weight. Elena felt something shift in the air between them, some implicit understanding that this was not charity or pity, but something more complex. Wade was offering them safety not because they deserved it, but because he needed to offer it, needed to prove to himself that decency still functioned in a world that had taken everything gentle from him. Mika spoke from the bed, her voice barely above a whisper. If we stay, we share the burden. We are not helpless things to be protected. We defend ourselves. Wade nodded slowly. Fair enough. That night they slept with the door latched from the inside. Wade made a bed for himself on the porch, his rifle within reach and his sleep shallow. Elena lay awake for hours listening to Mika's labored breathing and Nara's soft snoring and the distant howl of coyotes claiming the darkness. She thought about choices and consequences, about the dead guard whose name she tried not to remember, and the living man whose generosity she tried not to need. Somewhere past midnight, she finally drifted into something like rest, her hand wrapped around her knife, and her mind caught between wariness and the dangerous beginning of hope. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee. Alina woke to find Nara already up peering through the curtain at Wade, who was once again going about his morning tasks. The youngest sister turned when she heard Alina stir. He left bread and butter on the porch railing, did not knock, just left it there for us to find. Alina rose stiffly and checked on Mika. The middle sister's forehead felt cooler, her breathing more regular. The fever that had been building yesterday seemed to have crested and broken during the night. When Alina unwrapped the bandage to check the wound, she found it still angry, but no longer weeping the clear fluid that signaled infection advancing unchecked. She is improving. Nara joined her beside the bed. Whatever he put in, that wash worked. Or her body is stronger than the rot trying to claim it. Can both things not be true? Alina did not answer. She rewrapped Mika's shoulder with fresh cloth from Wade's carefully maintained supply, noting how even these small domestic items were organized with military precision. Everything in this house spoke of a man keeping chaos at bay through ritual and order. Each object in its place because disorder was too close to the grief he was holding back with both hands. They ate the bread Wade had left. It was fresh enough to still be warm, suggesting he had risen before dawn to bake it. The gesture felt weighted with meaning Alina could not quite name. They were strangers, fugitives, complications he did not need. Yet here he was baking bread and maintaining careful distance and offering them a sanctuary that could very well cost him everything. Mika woke around mid-morning. Her eyes were clearer, more focused. She managed to sit up without assistance, though the effort left her breathing hard. I need to walk. Her voice was stronger too. If I lie here much longer, my leg will forget how to carry me. Elena helped her stand. They moved slowly around the room, Mika leaning on her sister, but bearing more of her own weight than she had the day before. After several circuits, Mika paused at the window where Nara had been keeping watch. He is repairing the corral fence. Mika watched Wade work, alone out there with his back to the house. Easy target if we meant him harm. He knows that. Alina joined her at the window. He is telling us he trusts us not to. Foolish trust, maybe. Or maybe he understands that trust has to start somewhere, that someone has to go first. They spent the morning in quiet recovery, the three of them moving through Wade's space with increasing familiarity. Nara explored the small collection of books on the shelf, pulling out a water-damaged volume of poems that had been read so many times the spine had cracked in multiple places. Elena inventoried their meager possessions, taking stock of what they had and what they would need if they had to run again. Mika practiced walking each lap around the room, a small victory over the injury that had nearly killed her. Around noon, Wade returned carrying a bucket of fresh water. He paused at the door waiting. Elena nodded him in. He set the bucket on the table and remained standing, hands visible and posture open. How was the shoulder? Better. Mika answered directly, surprising them all. Your medicine worked. It is just willow bark and honey. Nothing miraculous. Miraculous enough. Wade seemed unsure how to respond to this small offering of gratitude. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat. I was wondering if you would allow me to check the bandage, make sure it is healing properly. Mika looked at Elena. Some silent communication passed between the sisters. Then Mika nodded. Elena stepped back slightly, giving Wade space but making it clear she was watching. He approached slowly, telegraphing every movement. Knelt beside where Mika sat so his eyes were level with hers. When he reached for the bandage, he paused first, waiting for final permission. Mika met his gaze and something unspoken passed between them, some acknowledgement of boundaries, and the mutual respect required to maintain them. The wound looked better in daylight. Still raw, still healing, but the edges had begun to knit together and the inflammation had receded. Wade applied fresh salve, his touch clinical and careful. Mika watched his face while he worked, studying him with an intensity that made Elena uncomfortable for reasons she could not quite articulate. You have done this before. Mika's statement was not a question. Field medicine during the war. Wade kept his eyes on his work. Men got hurt. Someone had to know how to keep them alive long enough to reach a surgeon. Which war? The one that supposedly ended but did not. Not for the Apache, not for anyone who lost something they can never get back. He finished rewrapping the wound and stood immediately, that careful distance reestablished. Mika continued watching him, something shifting in her expression that Elena recognized as dangerous. Her sister was beginning to trust this man, to see him as something other than a temporary respite from pursuit. That way lay complications they could not afford. Nara appeared from the back room carrying a coil of rope she had found in Wade's toolbox. She tossed it to him. Teach me something. Wade caught the rope awkwardly. What do you want to learn? Something useful. Something we did not know before we came here. Wade considered this. Then he began showing her a complicated knot, his fingers moving slowly so she could follow. Nara tried to mimic him. Failed. Tried again. Failed worse. Wade's mouth twitched into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. He stepped closer and guided her hands through the motion, his teaching patient and unhurried. Elena watched this small domestic scene unfold with mounting unease. They were settling in, growing comfortable, beginning to imagine this might last. She wanted to shake her sisters to remind them that comfort was a trap and trust a luxury they had not earned. But she also wanted to let them have this moment, these few hours where danger felt distant and the world consisted of rope tricks and clean bandages and bread left on porch railings. The afternoon stretched long. Nara convinced Wade to teach them English numbers, and he convinced her to teach him 3 words in Apache. They spent an hour counting fence posts visible from the window, their voices mixing in the quiet space until the lesson dissolved into something closer to laughter. Even Mika smiled, a genuine expression that looked foreign on her face after everything that had tried to steal her capacity for joy. But as evening approached, Elena's unease crystallized into certainty. She heard it before she saw it, that distant thunder of hooves that was not thunder at all, but violence approaching at speed. She moved to the window and saw dust rising in the east, a dark smudge against the failing light. That could only mean one thing. They found him. Wade was at her side instantly. How many? Cannot tell yet. 4 riders, maybe 5. He crossed to the door and pulled down his rifle. Checked the load with practiced efficiency. When he turned back to them, his face had gone carefully blank, all the gentle patience replaced by something harder and more familiar. Get away from the windows. Stay low. Do exactly what I say when I say it. Elena drew her knife. We fight with you. No. Wade's voice carried absolute authority. You stay inside. You stay hidden. You let me handle this. Mika struggled to her feet. We do not hide. We do not let men fight our battles. This is not about pride. Wade's eyes moved between the 3 sisters. This is about strategy. Right now, they do not know you are here. They might be looking, but they cannot be certain. If they see you, everything becomes harder. So you stay inside. You stay quiet. And if shooting starts, you run out the back and do not stop until you reach the tree line. The riders were closer now. Elena could count them clearly through the window. 5 men on horseback, moving fast, but not recklessly. One of them matched the description Mika had given of Clayton Voss, the foreman who ran the labor camp like his own private kingdom. Thick-shouldered and red-faced, sitting his horse like he owned not just the animal, but the very ground beneath its hooves. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. They had found them too quickly. Someone had talked or tracked them or simply guessed that 3 desperate women would run toward the first sign of shelter. Their brief respite was ending, and it was ending with violence. Wade moved to the door, opened it slowly, stepped out onto the porch with his rifle held low and ready. Elena watched through the window as the 5 riders pulled up 20 yards from the house, dust settling around them like a shroud. Voss spoke first, his voice carrying easily in the still air. You, Wade. Ethan Wade, I am. We are looking for 3 women. Apache. They stole from us and ran. We have reason to believe they came this way. I have seen no one. You mind if we look around, just to be certain? I mind very much. This is private property. You have no authority here. Voss leaned forward in his saddle. See, that is where you are wrong. These women are criminals. Theft, destruction of property, assault. We have every right to reclaim what is ours and see justice done. Women are not property. They cannot be stolen because they are not things to be owned. The statement hung in the air. One of the other riders, a younger man with a scar across his chin, laughed sharply. Voss silenced him with a glance. You got some strong opinions for a man living alone in the middle of nowhere. Makes me wonder what else you might be hiding. I am hiding nothing but my patience for men who show up on my land making demands. Inside the house, Mika had gone very still. Her hand gripped Elena's arm hard enough to leave marks. Nara had pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her young face aged by fear and fury in equal measure. The confrontation outside continued, 2 men measuring each other across impossible distance. Elena understood they had reached the moment where words would either diffuse the situation or light the fuse that would blow everything apart. She could see tension in Wade's shoulders the way his finger rested beside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. He was giving Voss room to make the right choice. Voss did not make the right choice. He jerked his head toward the house. Check it. Two of his men dismounted. Wade did not raise his rifle, but his voice carried a new edge. You take one more step toward my door, and we see how committed you are to finding three women who are not here. You threatening me, I am explaining consequences. Actions have them. You should consider yours carefully. The two men who had dismounted looked at Voss, looked at Wade, looked at each other. Neither moved. The moment stretched taut as wire, everything balanced on the edge of decisions that could not be unmade. Then Wade did something Elena had not expected. He lowered his rifle completely, set it against the porch railing, opened his hands toward Voss. You want to search my house? Come ahead. But you come alone, just you. Your men stay with the horses. You satisfy yourself that I am telling the truth, and then you ride out, and we both go on with our lives. The offer surprised everyone, including Voss. The foreman studied Wade with narrowed eyes, trying to see the trap. When he could not find one, he dismounted, handed his reins to the scarred man, walked slowly toward the porch. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at her sisters, mouthed the word that would send them running. But Nara shook her head, pointed at the knife in Elena's hand, mouthed back, only if we have to. Voss climbed the porch steps. Wade did not move from his position near the door. They stood perhaps 3 feet apart, two men playing a game where the rules were written in the space between threats. After you, Wade gestured toward the door. No, after you, I insist. Wade nodded slowly, turned, reached for the door handle. Elena felt time compress into this single moment, everything they had survived funneling down to this threshold that Wade was about to cross. If Voss saw them, if he confirmed their presence, everything Wade had offered would collapse into violence and blood and consequences that could not be outrun. The door opened. Wade stepped inside. And in the single second before Voss could follow, before he could see into the shadowed interior where 3 women pressed themselves against walls and held their breath, Mika did something that changed everything. She stood up, stepped directly into the light falling through the doorway. Let Voss see her clearly. Her voice came out strong despite the tremor beneath it. You want to find us. Here I am. The silence that followed Mika's declaration felt like falling. Voss froze mid-step, his boot hovering above the threshold. His eyes moved from Mika to the shadows behind her, where Elena and Nara pressed themselves against the wall. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with winning. Well now. He stepped fully inside his bulk, filling the doorway. Looks like Wade here is a liar after all. Ethan moved between Voss and Mika before the foreman could advance further. His voice stayed level, but something dangerous had crept into it. You got what you came for. Now leave. Leave. Voss laughed, a short, ugly sound. You think I rode 18 miles to just turn around? These women stole from me, destroyed property. One of them killed my guard. Your guard tried to rape her sister. Mika's English came out clipped but clear. Marcus Hale put his hands on Nara. Lena stopped him. That is not murder. That is justice. Justice, Voss rolled the word around like it tasted sour. You Indian girls got some strange ideas about justice. Way I see it, you owed me 6 more months of labor. You broke contract. That is theft of services. And Marcus, he spat the name. Marcus was a good man doing his job. Your sister cut his throat like a pig. Elena stepped forward into the light, her hand wrapped tight around her knife handle. He died like a pig because he acted like one. Voss's eyes went cold. There it is, the one who did it. You know what the law says about killing white men, girl. Does not matter why you did it, only matters what color you are when you stand trial. There will be no trial. Ethan's rifle was back in his hands, though Elena had not seen him retrieve it. You will leave my property. Now. Or what? You will shoot me. In front of my 4 men outside. You are good, Wade, but you are not that good. They will cut you down before you get a second shot. And then these women have no protection at all. The math was simple and terrible. Voss was right. Ethan could maybe take him, maybe take one of the others, but not all five. Not before they returned fire. Not before everything dissolved into the kind of violence that left only bodies and regret. Mika touched Ethan's arm, a light pressure that somehow carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. Her voice dropped to something gentler when she spoke. Let me go with him. Better one of us than all three. Better me than Alina, who they will hang for murder. No, Ethan did not take his eyes off Voss. That is not happening, boy. Voss's tone shifted to something almost conversational. You are in over your head here. This is not your fight. These women are criminals. I got paperwork back at camp showing they signed contracts. I got witnesses who will swear they attacked Marcus unprovoked. You keep them here, you become an accessory. That is federal prison time if you are lucky. If you are not lucky, you hang right alongside the one who did the killing. Then I guess we all better hope I am lucky. The two men stared at each other across 3 feet of charged air. Outside, one of Voss's riders called out, asking if everything was all right. The foreman did not break eye contact when he responded. We are fine, just having a conversation about property rights and the consequences of poor decisions. He took a step backward toward the door, kept his eyes on Ethan the whole time. When he reached the threshold, he paused. You got 24 hours, Wade. Tomorrow at sundown, I come back with the sheriff and proper paperwork. You can hand them over peaceful, or we take them by force. Your choice. But either way, justice gets done. He left then, his boots heavy on the porch boards. The 4 riders outside straightened when they saw him emerge alone. Words were exchanged too quiet to hear. Then Voss mounted up, and the 5 of them wheeled their horses and rode east, dust rising in their wake, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ethan stood in the doorway until the dust settled. When he finally turned around, his face had gone gray. He set the rifle down with shaking hands and braced himself against the wall. What were you thinking? The words came out hoarse. Showing yourself like that, you gave him everything he needed. Mika had not moved from where she stood in the center of the room. Her jaw set in a line that Alina recognized as stubborn pride mixed with desperate calculation. I gave him a choice. Come in and confirm we are here or leave uncertain. Either way, we buy time. If he had searched and found nothing, he would have known you lied, would have posted men to watch, would have caught us when we tried to run. This way he thinks he won, thinks he has time to do it legal. That gives us time to prepare. Prepare for what? Ethan's voice cracked on the question. You heard him. He is coming back with the law. There is no preparing for that. There is just delaying the inevitable. Nara had been quiet through the whole exchange. Now she spoke up, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from having already accepted the worst possible outcomes. Then we run. Tonight. Before he can come back. Run where? Alina finally found her voice. The reservation is 3 days north and they will expect us to go there. The labor camp is east. Towns are west, and they will not help Apache women accused of murder. We ran once already and it nearly killed Mika. We cannot run forever. So what do we do? Nara's certainty cracked around the edges. Just wait here for them to come back and take us. No, Ethan had recovered some color in his face. No, we fight. We make it so expensive to take you that they decide the cost is not worth it. 5 men minimum. Alina shook her head. Maybe more if Voss brings the sheriff and a proper posse. We are 3 women, 1 injured and 1 farmer. The math does not work. Then we change the math. How? Ethan moved to the window and looked out at his land. The corral with its half-repaired fence. The barn that needed new boards before winter. The creek bed that would run dry by August if the rains did not come. Everything he had built in the 3 years since he buried his wife and daughter. I know people in Haven Ridge, the town 5 miles west. Not everyone there is a friend to men like Voss. Some of them remember what it was like when the big ranchers tried to run everyone else off. Some of them might help. Might help is not a plan. Alina kept her voice flat. Might help gets us killed. Then what would you suggest? Ethan turned from the window. Because I am open to better ideas. The silence that followed carried the weight of impossible choices. Alina looked at her sisters. Mika still standing in the center of the room like she had taken root there. Nara pressed against the wall with her eyes too bright and her hands clenched into fists. They had run from one kind of prison and stumbled into another. The walls here were just made of distance and time instead of wooden locks. We need information. Mika spoke slowly, working through the problem like she was untangling a knot. Voss said he has paperwork. Witnesses. That means he has prepared for this moment. Probably since the night we ran. He cannot just show up with 5 men and take us by force. Not legally. So he will use law as a weapon instead. What good does knowing that do us? It tells us where to push back. If this is about law, about contracts and witnesses, then we need to break his legal case before he can present it. We need to prove his contracts were coerced, that his witnesses are lying, that his labor camp is the real crime, not our escape from it. And how exactly do we prove that from here? Nara gestured at the 4 walls surrounding them. We have no evidence, no witnesses of our own, no one who will believe our word over his. Then we get evidence. Mika's eyes moved to Ethan. You said you know people in Haven Ridge. Are any of them lawyers, judges, anyone with authority who might listen? There is a territorial judge named Helena Marks. She rides circuit through here twice a year, but she is not due back until September. 3 months too late. Elena felt hope dying before it could fully form. We need help now, not in September. Wait, Ethan's expression shifted as memory surfaced. There is someone else, a federal marshal named Quinn. He was in Haven Ridge last winter investigating labor practices at the silver mine. I spoke with him once. He paused, searching for the right word. Reasonable. More interested in justice than politics. Where is he now? Alina could read the answer on Ethan's face before he spoke. He finished his investigation. Left in March, could be anywhere in the territory, so we have no lawyer, no judge, and a maybe marshal who could be 300 miles away. Alina heard bitterness seeping into her voice. This is your plan. This is what we fight with. No. Ethan crossed to the small trunk by the wall. The one Nara had noticed contained women's clothing. He opened it and dug beneath the dresses until he found what he was looking for. A wooden box, plain and worn, secured with a simple latch. He set the box on the table, opened it. Inside were papers, letters, documents with official seals. Alina saw Ethan's name on some of them, but also other names she did not recognize. My wife kept records. He sorted through the papers with careful hands as if touching them hurt. Before she died, she worked with other women in the territory trying to document abuses. Labor camps that held workers past their contracts. Ranchers who paid in scrip instead of real money. All the ways powerful men bent law to serve themselves while claiming to uphold it. Why would she do this? Because she came from the Navajo. Ethan's voice went soft. Her mother was full blood, her father a traitor. She lived between 2 worlds and saw how both of them ground people up and spit them out. She thought if she could just get enough evidence, enough testimonies, someone would have to listen. Did anyone listen? She died before she could deliver it. Fever took her in 3 days, took our daughter in 2 more. I kept the box, but I never. He stopped, swallowed hard. I never had the courage to finish what she started. Elena lifted one of the papers. Saw cramped handwriting describing conditions at a ranch 70 miles south. Wages withheld, workers beaten, a woman who lost 3 fingers to a hay baler and was turned out with no compensation. The details were specific, damning, and utterly useless without someone willing to act on them. Your wife's courage does not help us now. She set the paper down gently despite her frustration. These are old crimes, old suffering. Voss is a new problem, but maybe the pattern helps. Mika had moved to the table and was reading over Elena's shoulder. If we can show that Voss is operating the same way these other men operated, if we can connect him to a larger pattern of abuse, then maybe we can get someone to pay attention. That is a lot of maybes. What choice do we have? The question hung there. No one answered because they all knew the answer was none. They had no choices, only degrees of impossible. Nara broke the silence. If we are going to do this, we need to move fast. Voss gave us 24 hours. That is not much time to build a case that could save our lives. Then we start now. Ethan began gathering the papers from the box. I ride to Haven Ridge tonight, find whoever might help. You 3 stay here and go through these documents. See if there is anything that mentions Voss or his operation, any connection we can use. You are not leaving us here alone. Elena's hand went to her knife. What if Voss changes his mind and comes back before morning? He won't. Ethan met her eyes. He is too proud. He told me 24 hours because he wants me to sit here and think about how thoroughly I am beaten. He wants me to stew in it. That pride is the only advantage we have. We use the time he gave us. The logic made sense even if Alina hated it. She nodded slowly. How long to Haven Ridge and back? 3 hours each way if I push. Maybe 4 to find the right people and convince them. I will be back by dawn, and if you are not, then you run. You take what you can carry and you head north. Do not wait for me. Do not look back. Mika stepped forward. Her voice came out quieter than before. Come back. That is an order, not a request. Something passed between them in that moment. Elena saw it clearly despite not understanding its full weight. Mika had made a claim. Ethan had accepted aunt. Whatever was building between them had just become explicit in a way that could not be unspoken. Ethan left within the hour. He took his fastest horse and his rifle and a canteen of water. The three sisters watched from the porch as he rode west into the gathering dusk, his silhouette shrinking against the horizon until it disappeared entirely. Then they went inside and began the work of sifting through a dead woman's crusade looking for weapons that might keep them alive one more day. The documents covered the table in overlapping layers. Alina read testimony from a woman who had been beaten for refusing her foreman's advances. Nara studied a contract that promised fair wages but contained clauses that made workers liable for their own housing, food, and tools at prices that ensured they could never settle their debts. Mika found a letter from a territorial official acknowledging reports of abuse at various labor camps, but declining to investigate without more substantive proof. We are not the first. Nara set down the contract she had been reading. This has been happening for years. To Apache, to Navajo, to anyone desperate enough to sign papers they cannot read and trust promises from men who have no intention of keeping them. No, we are not the first. Mika's finger traced a line of text in the letter from the official. But maybe we can be the ones who finally make someone care. How? Alina gestured at the papers surrounding them. This woman, Ethan's wife, she gathered all this evidence and she died before she could do anything with it. What makes you think we will succeed? Where she failed, because we have no choice. Mika looked up, her eyes carrying the weight of everything they had survived to reach this room. She had the luxury of time, of thinking she could slowly build a case over months or years. We have one day. That urgency might be the only thing that works in our favor. They worked through the night. As hours passed, a pattern emerged from the documents. Most of the abuses were concentrated in the southern part of the territory. The same names appeared repeatedly as complainants. The same names appeared as perpetrators. And buried in the middle of it all, appearing in 3 separate testimonies, was Clayton Voss. Look at this. Nara held up a paper dated 2 years prior. A Pima woman named Rosa Delgado testified that Voss held her at his camp for 8 months past her contract. When she tried to leave, he claimed she owed him for damaged equipment. There is a note here from someone named Chavez saying he personally confirmed Delgado's story but lacked authority to act on it. Who is Chavez? Mika found another mention of the name, Alejandro Chavez, former deputy territorial marshal. It says here he resigned his position over disagreements about enforcement priorities. There is an address listed. Haven Ridge. Elena felt something shift in her chest. A former marshal who quit because he could not stomach the corruption. That might be their lever. That might be the person who would listen when no one else would. Do you think Ethan knows about him? If he is asking around Haven Ridge, he will find out. Small towns talk. Someone will mention the marshal who left. They kept reading. More testimony, more patterns. By the time false dawn began to gray the eastern windows, they had assembled a rough picture of an interconnected system of exploitation. Voss was not operating alone. He had backing from ranchers who needed cheap labor, protection from officials who looked the other way in exchange for contributions and favors. The whole structure depended on keeping victims isolated, undocumented, and afraid. The question is whether any of this matters. Alina stood and stretched, feeling her spine pop. We know the system is corrupt. Everyone knows. The question is whether we can make someone with power care enough to do something about it. Mika did not answer right away. She was staring at one document in particular, reading it over and over. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted into something sharp and calculating. What if we do not need someone with power to care? What if we just need someone with power to see an opportunity? Explain, these documents mention territorial elections coming up. Governors, territorial legislature, local sheriffs. Ethan's wife wrote notes in the margins about how reform candidates could use labor issues to win support. What if we find a candidate who needs a cause and give them one? You want to make our survival a political campaign. I want to make it too expensive for them to ignore us. If a reform candidate takes up our case publicly, Voss cannot just make us disappear. He has to defend himself, has to answer questions. And maybe in that process, the whole rotten structure becomes visible enough that someone has to do something about it. That is, Nara paused. Actually clever. Cynical but clever. Elena was less convinced. And what if there is no reform candidate? What if every politician in this territory is already bought and paid for by men like Voss? Then we are no worse off than we are right now. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the pre-dawn quiet. Elena moved to the window and saw Ethan returning his horse lathered and blowing hard. He was not alone. Behind him rode two others. A man and a woman, both carrying themselves with the easy confidence of people who knew how to sit a horse and were not afraid of where it might take them. Ethan dismounted and helped the woman down. She was perhaps 40 with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. The man who followed her looked younger, maybe 30, with the hard hands of someone who worked for a living and the careful posture of someone who had learned to watch his back. They came inside. Ethan made quick introductions. The woman was Margaret Sullivan, widow of a rancher and current owner of the second largest spread in the county. The man was Alejandro Chavez, former deputy territorial marshal and current blacksmith. Elena's breath caught when she heard Chavez's name. She looked at Mika and saw her sister's eyes widen with recognition. This was the man from the documents, the one who quit rather than continue enforcing laws selectively. Wade tells me you have a problem with Clayton Voss. Margaret's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of telling men what to do and having them do it. Good. I have been waiting for someone to give me a reason to move against that son of a bitch. You know Voss. Know him. I have been fighting him for 3 years over water rights and grazing boundaries. He thinks because he has the sheriff in his pocket that he can do whatever he wants. I have been looking for leverage to break him. You three might be exactly what I need. Chavez moved to the table where the documents still lay scattered. He picked up one, read it, set it down. Picked up another. His jaw tightened with each page. I remember some of these cases. He spoke quietly like a man confessing old sins. I filed reports, requested investigations, got told repeatedly that there were bigger priorities, that I needed to focus on real crimes instead of chasing complaints from Indians and Mexicans who probably did not understand their contracts anyway. Why did you quit? Nara asked. Because I could not live with being part of the machinery that ground people up. Chavez looked at her directly. I am not a hero. I did not blow any whistles or make any grandstands. I just walked away because I was too much of a coward to keep doing what I was doing. But maybe, he gestured at the papers, maybe I can stop being a coward now. Margaret had been studying the three sisters with an appraising eye. Ethan says Voss is claiming you stole from him. Broke a contract. That true. We worked. Elena answered carefully. We were promised wages, room and board, protection. We received none of those things. We received locked doors and violence and demands that kept extending our contracts every time we got close to fulfilling them. When my youngest sister was assaulted, I stopped the man doing it. He died, so we ran. That is the whole truth of what Voss calls theft. Margaret nodded slowly. How bad did you hurt the man who died? Bad enough that he will never hurt anyone again. Good. Margaret's voice carried no judgment, only cold satisfaction. Men like that are a waste of air. You saved the territory the cost of a trial and a rope. The statement hung in the air. Elena felt something unknot in her chest. This woman believed them. More than that, she approved. Chavez had pulled a chair close to the table and was making notes in a small leather journal. Tell me everything about Voss's operation, location, how many workers, what the contracts actually say versus what he tells people, who comes and goes, any officials who visit, everything you remember. For the next hour, the three sisters described the camp in exhaustive detail. The barracks where 30 women slept in conditions designed for maybe 15. The work schedule that stretched from before dawn to well past dark. The pay that never came because of mysterious charges for food that was spoiled and tools that broke and medical care that was never provided. The guards who treated workers like property they could use however they wanted. Chavez wrote it all down with a hand that shook slightly. When they finished, he sat back and closed the journal. This is enough. If even half of what you described can be corroborated, Voss is running an operation that violates at least a dozen federal statutes. Involuntary servitude, fraud, assault. If I can get this information to the right federal official, Margaret cut him off, if is the problem. Every official in this territory who might care is also overworked, underpaid, and probably already compromised. We need more than evidence. We need a story that people will care about. We need to make this personal. How do we do that? Elections. Mika spoke up for the first time since Margaret and Chavez arrived. There are territorial elections this fall. Reform candidates need issues. We give them one. Margaret's eyes sharpen. You understand politics. That is good. You are right that reform candidates need ammunition. But you need to understand what you are offering to become. If you go public with this, you stop being people and start being symbols. Margaret paused, her expression darkening. And there is something else you should know. Voss has connections beyond the territorial level. I heard through back channels that he has been reaching out to federal magistrates in Albuquerque. If he cannot win here, he may try to move the case to federal jurisdiction where he has more leverage. What does that mean? Mika asked. It means he could potentially get federal warrants issued, change the charges, make this about interstate commerce or contract law instead of territorial labor violations. Margaret's jaw tightened. We need to move faster than he can build that case. Once federal machinery starts turning, it becomes much harder to stop. Everything about your lives becomes public. Every mistake you ever made gets used against you. And if the reform candidate loses, you lose everything. We have already lost everything. Alina heard her own voice coming from a distance. The only question is whether we can take Voss down with us. Maybe not the only question. Had been quiet through most of the discussion. Now he stepped forward. Maybe the question is whether we can win. Actually win, not just fight and lose heroically. And how do we do that? Margaret asked. We make it a fight Voss cannot win no matter what he does. If he backs down, he looks weak and his whole operation gets scrutinized. If he pushes forward, we make sure every step is public and documented and impossible to ignore. Either way, we win. That is optimistic. Chavez closed his journal. Voss has money and connections. You have righteousness and desperation. History does not favor your odds. Then we change history. The room fell silent. Outside, true dawn had arrived, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere out there, Clayton Voss was waking up and planning his triumphant return with the sheriff and proper paperwork. He thought he had already won. Thought he had cornered 3 desperate women and 1 isolated farmer. He had no idea what he had actually done was unite 5 people who each had their own reasons to want him broken. A widow who needed leverage. A former marshal who needed redemption. A farmer who needed purpose. And 3 women who needed to prove they were more than what the world had tried to make them. Margaret stood. I need to send telegrams. Call in favors. Get this story in front of people who can amplify it. Chavez, you work on documenting everything that can be verified independently. Wade, she paused. You keep these women alive. That is your only job. Keep them alive long enough for the rest of us to build the case that will save them. And us. Nara's voice was small. What do we do? You stay hidden, stay safe, and you prepare for what comes next. Because when Voss shows up tonight, we need to be ready to turn his victory into his worst mistake. They dispersed to their tasks. Margaret rode back toward Haven Ridge to begin her political maneuvering. Chavez headed to the county recorder's office to pull documents on Voss's land claims and business licenses. Ethan sent telegrams to contacts across the territory spreading word of what was happening before Voss could control the narrative. The 3 sisters stayed at the homestead, waiting for sundown and whatever it would bring. They cleaned weapons and rehearsed plans and tried not to think too hard about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Mika found Ethan on the porch as afternoon shadows began to stretch long. He was checking his rifle for the 3rd time, his hands moving through the familiar motions with mechanical precision. You do not have to do this. Her voice made him look up. You could tell us to leave. Tell Voss you realize we were criminals and turned us out. You would be safe. Safe is overrated. He set the rifle aside. I have been safe for 3 years. It has not made me happy. It has not made me whole. Maybe danger is what I need. That is foolish reasoning. Maybe, but it is my reasoning. He met her eyes. Besides, I could say the same to you. You could have run last night, could have been miles away by now. But you stayed. Where would we go? Mika's smile was bitter. Nowhere. That is not just another version of the same trap. At least here we know the dimensions of what we are facing. They stood together watching the sun crawl toward the horizon. Every minute that passed brought them closer to the confrontation they all knew was coming. Voss would arrive with the sheriff and probably more men. He would have papers and legal authority and all the machinery of law twisted to serve his purposes. But he would also be walking into something he did not expect. Not a defeated farmer and 3 cornered women, but a fight that had already grown beyond his ability to control it. Word was spreading. People were paying attention. What happened in the next few hours would determine not just their fates, but the fate of every other desperate person trapped in operations like Voss's. The weight of that should have been crushing. Instead, Mika felt something else entirely: clarity, purpose, the sense that finally, after months of being ground down and stripped of agency, she was about to reclaim some measure of control over her own story. Alana called from inside. Riders coming, 8 of them this time. Voss had brought reinforcements. Beside him rode a man wearing a sheriff's star that glinted in the late afternoon light. The others looked like ranch hands, hired for muscle men, who would follow orders and not ask inconvenient questions about legality or morality. Ethan stepped off the porch. Behind him, visible through the open door, the 3 sisters stood in clear view. No more hiding, no more pretending they were not there. If this was going to be a fight about law and justice, it would be conducted in daylight where everyone could see. Voss pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards out. The sheriff moved up beside him, a man in his 50s with a face that had gone soft from too much whiskey and not enough walking. He pulled a paper from his coat pocket and held it up. Ethan Wade, I got a warrant here for the arrest of 3 Apache women accused of theft, destruction of property, and murder. You got those women here. You need to turn them over right now or face charges as an accessory. On what grounds is the warrant issued? Ethan's voice carried clearly in the still air. I just told you. Theft, destruction, no. What evidence supports the warrant? What testimony? What proof beyond the word of the man who claims to be the victim? The sheriff's face reddened. I do not have to explain legal matters to you, Wade. I got a judge's signature. That is all I need. Which judge? Judge Harlan Winters out of Socorro. Winters, Ethan let the name hang for a moment. The same Judge Winters who owes Clayton Voss money for cattle purchased on credit. The same Judge Winters who was censured 2 years ago for issuing questionable warrants on behalf of business associates. That Judge Winters. You are treading. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun. I am asking questions that any citizen has a right to ask. The warrant may be legal on its face, but if it was obtained through improper means, it is void. You are not a lawyer, no, but I know people who are, and they are very interested in this case. Voss had been quiet up until now. He kneed his horse forward. Enough games, Wade. You got till the count of 10 to turn over those women, or we come in and take them. 1, you will do no such thing. The voice came from behind Ethan. Margaret Sullivan rode into view, her horse moving at a casual walk that suggested she had all the time in the world. Behind her came Chavez and 4 other riders Alina did not recognize. Margaret. Voss's face went tight. This does not concern you. Really? Because I am pretty sure illegal detention of workers violates the Range Association bylaws we all agreed to last year. The ones about maintaining ethical business practices so we do not bring federal scrutiny down on all of us. You running a labor camp that violates those bylaws makes it very much my concern. These women signed contracts. Contracts obtained through fraud. Chavez had dismounted and was walking forward with a sheaf of papers. I have testimony here from 6 former workers at your camp describing how you misrepresented the terms, how you extended contracts through bogus charges, how you prevented workers from leaving through threats and violence. That is not contract labor. That is slavery by another name. Those are lies. Voss's voice rose. Disgruntled workers making up stories. Funny how the stories all match. Margaret's tone stayed even. Funny how three separate sources who have never met all describe the same practices in the same words. That is what we call a pattern, Clayton. And patterns are hard to dismiss. The sheriff looked between Voss and Margaret, clearly trying to calculate which side he wanted to be on. The warrant in his hands suddenly seemed less certain. Even if what you say is true, the sheriff's voice had lost its earlier authority. Even if Voss did run his camp wrong, these women still killed a man. That is murder. That does not go away because of bad working conditions. Self-defense. Elena stepped out onto the porch. She had stayed silent long enough. Marcus Hale attempted to rape my sister. I stopped him. New Mexico law says a person has the right to use deadly force to prevent rape or serious bodily harm. I exercise that right. That is for a court to decide. Then charge me. Try me. Put me in front of a jury and let them hear what Hale was doing when I killed him. Let them hear about all the other women he hurt. Let them decide whether I committed murder or did the community a service. The challenge hung in the air. The sheriff looked at Voss again, silently asking for direction. Voss's face had gone from red to something closer to purple. You want a trial? His voice shook with rage. Fine. We will have a trial. We will drag every piece of dirty laundry out into the light. We will talk about what you three did in that camp before you killed Marcus. We will talk about the men you serviced and the money you took and all the ways you tried to work off your debt before you decided murder was easier. The accusation landed like a blow. Elena felt it in her chest, that familiar twist of shame and rage that came whenever men tried to use her body as a weapon against her. She opened her mouth to respond, but Mika beat her to it. Do it. Her voice cut through the afternoon like a blade. Put it all in the record. Every time your guards raped workers. Every woman who got pregnant and was turned out. Every injury you refused to treat. Every wage you withheld. Make it all public. See how that works out for you. Voss seemed to realize he had made a mistake. His bluster deflated slightly. The men behind him shifted uncomfortably. Even the sheriff looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Margaret pressed the advantage. Here is what is going to happen, Clayton. You are going to withdraw that warrant. You are going to release any workers currently at your camp who want to leave. You are going to cooperate with a territorial investigation into labor practices. And in exchange, maybe we do not make your name synonymous with slavery and rape. And if I refuse, then we go to trial. We make this the biggest story in the territory. Every newspaper, every reform politician, every federal official looking to make a name. They all hear about Clayton Voss and his camp of horrors. You become the face of everything wrong with the old ways. Your name becomes poison. And even if you win the legal fight, you lose everything that matters. The silence stretched. Elena could see Voss calculating, weighing options, trying to find a path that did not end with his complete destruction. She knew the math was against him. Too many people were watching now, too many interests aligned against him. He could fight, but he could not win. Finally he spoke. His voice had gone flat and dead. You got 2 weeks. 2 weeks to file your evidence with territorial authorities. If they decide to investigate, I will cooperate. But those women. He pointed at the three sisters. They do not leave Wade's property. They stay right here where I can see them. They try to run. Our deal is off and I come after them with everything I got. Agreed, Margaret answered before Ethan could object. They stay here, under Wade's protection. You get 2 weeks to get your affairs in order before the hammer falls. This is not over. No, it is not, but it is over for today. Voss wheeled his horse around. The sheriff and the other riders followed, leaving behind nothing but dust and the lingering smell of horses and fear. When they were gone, when the last hoofbeat had faded, Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. We won. Nara's voice carried disbelief. We actually won. We survived. Ethan corrected gently. That is not the same as winning, but it is a start. Margaret dismounted and stretched. I need a drink and I need to send more telegrams. Chavez, you start documenting everything we can verify about Voss's operation. We have 2 weeks to build an airtight case. What about us? Mika asked. You heard Voss. You stay here. Stay visible. Stay alive. The moment you disappear, he tears up our agreement and we are back to square one. So we are prisoners again. Alina heard the bitterness in her own voice. Just prettier ones. You are protected. Margaret met her eyes. There is a difference. And if you cannot see it yet, you will. She rode off with Chavez and the others, leaving the four of them standing in the yard as the evening shadows grew long. They had fought and survived, bought time, gained allies, shifted the balance of power just enough to create space for something that might, with luck and continued effort, become actual freedom. But they were not free yet. Not really. They were still bound by circumstances and threats in the watching eyes of men who wanted them broken. The fight had just begun. What came next would be harder, more complicated, more dangerous. Alina looked at her sisters, at Ethan standing beside them like he belonged there, at the homestead that had become both sanctuary and cage. They had changed the rules of engagement. Now they had to figure out how to actually win a game where the other side controlled the board and most of the pieces. Inside, they ate in silence. The tension of the confrontation still hummed in the air. No one wanted to celebrate too early to assume that Voss would actually honor their agreement or that 2 weeks would be enough time to build the case they needed. When night fell, Ethan took first watch. The three sisters tried to sleep, but none of them could fully relax. They drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, always half aware of sounds outside of the possibility that Voss might change his mind and come back in the darkness to finish what he had started. Morning came with no violence, just another day of waiting and preparing and hoping that the machinery they had set in motion would grind fast enough to save them. The days that followed moved with a strange dual quality of crawling and racing. Each hour stretched interminably while somehow the 2-week deadline rushed toward them at terrifying speed. The homestead became a hub of constant activity. Messengers arrived at odd hours carrying documents and testimony. Margaret sent riders with updates on political maneuvering happening in territorial offices. Chavez appeared every other day with new evidence, his journal growing thick with damning details. Through it all, the three sisters remained confined to the property. Not locked in, not physically restrained, but bound by the knowledge that leaving meant breaking the fragile truce, keeping them alive. Alina paced the perimeter like a caged animal, her frustration building with each circuit. Nara threw herself into helping Ethan with farm work, finding solace in physical labor that produced visible results. And Mika grew quieter each day, watching everything with eyes that saw more than she spoke about. On the third morning, a new visitor arrived, a man in his early 30s wearing clothes that marked him as educated and probably wealthy. He introduced himself as James Whitmore, attorney at law, sent by a reform coalition that had taken interest in their case. I need to interview each of you separately. Whitmore set his leather satchel on Ethan's table. Get your stories on record, documented testimony that can be used in court if necessary. If necessary, Alina repeated. You mean you are not certain this will go to trial? Nothing is certain. Whitmore pulled out paper and pen. But we need to be prepared for every possibility. That means having your accounts documented in detail with dates and names and specific incidents. No vagueness, no generalizations, just facts that can be verified or at least corroborated. He spent 6 hours with them. Each sister sat alone while he asked questions that cut like scalpels, precise and invasive. When it was Elena's turn, he made her describe Marcus Hale's death in exhaustive detail. The angle of the knife, the sound he made when the blade found his throat, the exact words he had been saying to Nara when Elena intervened. Why does this matter? Elena kept her voice level, though her hands shook. He was raping my sister. Does the specific angle of the knife change whether that was justified? It matters because the other side will use every detail to undermine your claim of self-defense. Whitmore did not look up from his notes. They will say you attacked him from behind, that he never threatened you specifically, that you used excessive force when lesser intervention would have sufficed. I need to be able to counter every argument before they make it. When he finished with Elena, he moved to Mika. Her interview lasted even longer because her injuries provided physical evidence that needed careful documentation. Whitmore made notes about the shoulder wound, the limp, the bruises that had faded, but left their mark in her careful movements. Did Voss or any of his men personally commit violence against you? Whitmore's pen hovered over paper. Define violence. Physical harm, beating, sexual assault. Anything that left marks or caused injury. Mika was quiet for a long moment. Then Voss never touched me himself. He had men for that. Marcus Hale before my sister killed him. A guard named Rodriguez, who liked to use his fists when women worked too slowly. Another one whose name I never learned, who thought locked doors and isolation meant he could do whatever he wanted. Did you report these assaults? To who? Voss ran the camp. The guards worked for him. There was no authority above him that we could reach. Complaining meant punishment, usually extra work or reduced food, sometimes worse. Whitmore wrote it all down with a face that stayed carefully neutral. When he finally closed his journal, Mika spoke again. You think we can win this? I think you have a stronger case than Voss wants anyone to know. Whether that translates to legal victory depends on factors outside my control. Which judge hears it? Which jury gets impaneled? How much political pressure gets applied and from which direction? That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I can give. Nara's interview was shorter but no less intense. She described the assault that had precipitated everything, her voice steady, but her hands clenched into fists the entire time. Whitmore asked terrible questions about penetration and resistance and what exactly Marcus Hale had done in the seconds before Alina's knife found him. Nara answered them all with a flatness that worried Alina more than tears would have. When Whitmore finally left, the three sisters sat together in silence. The interviews had dredged up memories they had been trying to bury beneath the work of survival. Now those memories sat raw and bleeding in the space between them. I need air. Nara stood abruptly and walked out onto the porch. Elena found her there an hour later, sitting on the top step with her knees drawn to her chest. The posture made her look impossibly young, more like the 15-year-old girl she had been when their father died than the survivor she had been forced to become. You did well in there. Elena sat beside her. I described my own rape in clinical detail so a lawyer can use it to maybe convince strangers I am worth protecting. That is not doing well. That is just more violation wearing different clothes. Elena had no answer to that. It was true. The whole process of seeking justice required them to wound themselves over and over to display their trauma for examination by people who had never experienced anything like it. The unfairness of it sat like lead in her stomach. Do you think Father would be proud of us? Nara's question came out small. Or would he think we brought shame on ourselves by letting it get this far? Father would have killed Marcus Hale himself and burned Voss's camp to ash. Elena spoke with certainty. He would be proud we survived. Proud we are fighting. The shame is not ours. It belongs to men like Voss who built systems designed to break people like us. Nara leaned against her sister's shoulder. They sat that way as the sun tracked west, two women holding each other up against the weight of everything trying to crush them down. Inside, Mika had found Ethan in his small back room. He was cleaning rifles with methodical care, each motion precise and practiced. She watched him for a moment before speaking. You are preparing for war. I am preparing for the possibility that our truce with Voss does not hold. He looked up. You should not be back here. The others will talk. Let them talk. Mika moved closer. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Anything. If this goes badly, if Voss breaks the agreement and comes for us, will you fight knowing you will probably die? Ethan set down the rifle he had been cleaning. Yes. Why? Because some things matter more than staying alive. Because my wife spent years trying to document abuse and died before she could stop it. Because my daughter never got the chance to become the person she should have been. Because if I do nothing, if I just let this happen, then what was the point of surviving them at all? That is a lot of weight to carry. We all carry weight. At least this weight has purpose. Mika stepped closer still, near enough to see the fine lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his hair at the temples. She reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the table. When this is over, when we are either free or dead, I want you to know that you gave us something no one else did. You saw us as people worth protecting before we proved we deserved it. That matters. Ethan turned his hand over and squeezed hers gently. You deserved it from the moment you walked onto my land. You always deserved it. They stood that way for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then Mika stepped back, the moment ending, before it could become something that complicated everything further. But the acknowledgement hung between them now, explicit and undeniable. Whatever happened next, they would face it knowing this connection existed. The first crack in their tenuous peace came on day 7. A rider arrived at dawn with news that made Margaret's face go tight with barely controlled fury. Judge Winters had dismissed the territorial investigation before it could formally begin claiming insufficient evidence and jurisdiction issues. That lying snake. Margaret paced Ethan's small parlor like a hunting cat. We gave him testimony from 8 witnesses. We documented violations of 3 separate federal statutes. And he just waves his hand and makes it disappear. Can we appeal? Chavez looked up from the report he had been reading. To who? The Territorial Supreme Court is 3 judges, 2 of whom owe favors to the same ranchers who back Voss. We would be asking the Fox to investigate the hen house. Then we need to go federal. Ethan leaned against the wall. Find a U.S. Marshal who will take the case seriously. I have been trying. Margaret's voice carried frustration. Every federal official I contact says it is a territorial matter. Every territorial official says they need federal authority. We are being passed back and forth while Voss laughs and counts down the days until he can come at you again. What about the reform candidates? Mika spoke from where she stood near the window. You said they needed issues. Have they stepped up? 2 of them have made statements. Margaret pulled papers from her bag. Weak statements that condemn labor abuses generally while avoiding Voss specifically. They want the political benefit without the risk of actually taking a stand. Then we make them take a stand. Alina had been quiet through most of the discussion. Now she moved to the table. We go public ourselves, tell our story directly, make it impossible for them to hide behind generalities. That is dangerous. Chavez shook his head. Right now you have some protection because this is being handled quietly through legal channels. You go public, you become targets. Every detail of your lives gets scrutinized. Every mistake you ever made gets weaponized against you. What choice do we have? Alina's voice rose slightly. Wait quietly while the system protects the man trying to destroy us. Hope that maybe someone will eventually care enough to act. That is not a plan. That is just slow surrender. She is right. Mika surprised everyone by siding with her sister. We have been letting other people fight this battle for us, making ourselves small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of justice they might throw our way. Maybe it is time we stop asking permission to be heard. Margaret studied them both with an expression that mixed respect and concern. If you do this, there is no going back. Your faces will be in newspapers. Your names will be known. You lose whatever privacy and safety anonymity provided. We lost that the moment Voss showed up with a warrant. Alina met Margaret's gaze steadily. At least this way we control the narrative. We tell the truth before he can bury it under lies. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the stakes. Going public meant escalation. It meant making themselves visible targets, but it also meant seizing agency in a situation where they had almost none. Sometimes the only power available was the power to make noise. Margaret finally nodded. All right, I know a journalist in Santa Fe, woman named Catherine Price who writes for the Territorial Gazette. She has been covering labor issues for years. If anyone will tell your story fairly, it is her. How fast can you get her here? If I send a telegram today, she could arrive by tomorrow evening. Do it. Mika spoke with finality. We give her everything. The full story, nothing held back. Let Voss try to explain himself after the whole territory reads what he has been doing. Ethan looked troubled, but did not argue. Chavez made notes in his journal about how to prepare for the interview. Margaret left to send the telegram, her horse kicking up dust as she rode hard toward Haven Ridge. Nara had been uncharacteristically quiet through the whole discussion. Now she spoke up, her voice carrying an edge of something that might have been fear or might have been excitement. When people read our story, they will know what happened to us. All of it. Everything those men did. Yes. Elena understood what her sister was really asking. They will know, but they will also know we survived it. Know we fought back. Maybe that matters more. Or maybe it just makes us permanent victims in everyone's eyes. Nara stood and moved to the window. Maybe we become the sad Apache girls who got hurt instead of the women who are fighting for justice. Then we make sure the journalist tells it right. Mika joined her at the window. We make sure she understands we are not asking for pity. We are demanding accountability. The day passed in tense preparation. Whitmore returned to help them organize their testimony into a narrative that would work for a newspaper audience. He coached them on how to be specific without being gratuitous, how to convey the horror of their experience without reducing it to titillation. That evening, as Elena sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan joined her. They had not spoken privately since the confrontation with Voss, both of them maintaining careful distance, as if afraid of what might happen if they got too close. "You are scared." Ethan made it a statement rather than a question. Terrified. Elena did not see the point in lying. Once our faces are in the paper, once our names are public, we become targets for every person who thinks Indians deserve what they get. Half the territory will think Voss is justified. The other half will not care enough to do anything about it. And yet you pushed for this anyway, because being scared of consequence is not a reason to accept injustice. My father used to say that the only thing worse than fighting and losing is not fighting at all. At least if we lose having tried everything. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was. And then he died in a winter camp when the government rations they promised never arrived. His wisdom did not save him. But maybe it can save us. They sat in companionable silence as the stars emerged one by one. Somewhere out there, Clayton Voss was planning his next move. Somewhere closer, Margaret was arranging the interview that would either save them or seal their doom. And here on this porch, two people who should have been strangers sat together and found comfort in simply not being alone. Catherine Price arrived the next evening as promised. She was younger than Elena expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and hands stained with ink. She carried a notebook that looked like it had been through a war and a pencil she kept tucked behind her ear when not actively writing. "I need you to understand something before we begin." Catherine set her bag down and looked at each sister in turn. "What you tell me will be printed. Not sanitized, not softened. The truth as you lived it. That means describing things that will make readers uncomfortable. Are you prepared for that?" "We are prepared," Mika answered for all of them. The interview lasted 3 hours. Catherine asked questions that cut to bone and sinew, forcing them to relive trauma in detail while she scribbled frantically. Unlike Whitmore with his legal precision, Catherine wanted emotion. She wanted readers to feel the fear and pain and rage that had driven these three women to risk everything rather than submit. When she finally closed her notebook, her face had gone pale. "I have covered labor abuses for 6 years, written about mine collapses and factory fires, and children worked to death in textile mills. This is worse. This is systematic dehumanization dressed up as legal employment. Will you write it?" Elena needed to know. "Will you actually publish what we told you?" "Every word." Catherine's voice carried steel. "And if my editor tries to bury it, I will take it to every other paper in the territory until someone prints it." The story ran 4 days later. 2 full pages in the Territorial Gazette, with a headline that pulled no punches: "Apache women escape forced labor camp, face prosecution for self-defense." Catherine had written it with prosecutorial precision, laying out each abuse in language that made it impossible to dismiss or ignore. The response was immediate and explosive. Letters flooded into the Gazette office, split almost perfectly between those demanding Voss's prosecution and those insisting the women were criminals who deserved no sympathy. 3 territorial legislators called for formal investigations. 5 others dismissed the whole thing as sensationalized journalism designed to smear honest businessmen. Reform candidates suddenly found their voices. 2 of them held rallies where they read excerpts from the article and promised to clean up labor practices if elected. Editorial pages across the territory picked up the story, each adding their own commentary and analysis. And Clayton Voss issued a response that appeared in every paper willing to print it. In it, he portrayed himself as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by business rivals and radical reformers. He claimed the 3 women had been treated fairly, that their contracts were legitimate, that Marcus Hale had been murdered without provocation. He promised legal action against everyone involved in what he called a conspiracy to destroy his reputation. Margaret arrived at the homestead the morning after Voss's response published. Her face carried grim satisfaction. He took the bait. She dropped a stack of newspapers on Ethan's table. He put his name on a defense that can be fact-checked and dismantled. Every claim he made can be countered with evidence we have been gathering. He just turned this from a quiet legal matter into a very public referendum on his character. That is good. Chavez had come with her, his journal now supplemented by additional files. I have been coordinating with former workers who are willing to testify. We have 7 people ready to contradict Voss's version of events under oath. When can we move against him? Alina felt impatience burning in her chest. We have evidence. We have testimony. We have public attention. What more do we need? We need the right venue. Margaret spread her hands on the table. A judge who will not be intimidated or bought. A jury pool that has not already made up their minds. Going to trial in this environment is dangerous. Half the territory thinks you are heroes. The other half thinks you are criminals. That kind of division makes conviction very easy for whichever side gets lucky with jury selection. So what do we do? Mika asked. Keep waiting while Voss chips away at our support. We apply pressure from multiple angles. Margaret began ticking off on her fingers. Whitmore files formal complaints with territorial labor officials. Chavez gets his testimony to federal marshals who might actually care. I work the political side, making sure reform candidates understand their futures are tied to how this resolves. And you 3, she paused, you keep doing exactly what you have been doing. Stay visible. Stay strong. Make it impossible for people to forget that real human beings are at the center of this fight. The days that followed brought unexpected developments. A delegation of Apache leaders from 3 different reservations issued a joint statement supporting the sisters and calling for federal investigation of labor practices throughout the territory. A prominent rancher who had feuded with Voss for years came forward with testimony about suspicious deaths at the labor camp. 2 territorial representatives announced they were drafting legislation to reform work contracts and establish oversight of labor operations. But with each piece of good news came complications. Pro-Voss newspapers ran editorials condemning outside agitators and radicals trying to destroy legitimate businesses. An anonymous letter arrived at the homestead threatening violence if the sisters did not recant their accusations. 3 jurors on the territorial grand jury were revealed to have financial ties to Voss's operation. On day 14, their 2-week truce expired. Alina woke that morning with her stomach in knots, certain that Voss would arrive with men and guns to finish what he had started. She checked weapons compulsively, watched the horizon for dust, waited for violence that felt inevitable. But Voss did not come. Sunset arrived with no confrontation. The next morning brought only more newspapers and another letter from Whitmore updating them on legal maneuvering. The silence felt more ominous than any direct threat. He is planning something. Ethan spoke what they were all thinking. The truce expired and he did nothing. That means he is confident in whatever his next move is. Or it means our campaign is working. Nara offered a more optimistic interpretation. Maybe he knows he cannot win in public opinion, so he is looking for a way to cut his losses. Men like Voss do not cut losses. Margaret had become a near-permanent fixture at the homestead, coordinating strategy from Ethan's kitchen table. They doubled down. They find new angles of attack. The silence just means we have not seen his countermove yet. The countermove revealed itself 3 days later. A new warrant was issued, this time from a federal magistrate in Albuquerque. The charge had changed from theft and murder to violating the Anti-Peonage Act by fleeing legitimate employment. The legal theory was creative and cynical. By escaping, the sisters had allegedly made it impossible for Voss to defend himself against their accusations, thus depriving him of due process. That is the most backwards legal reasoning I have ever seen. Whitmore read the warrant with mounting disbelief. They are claiming the victims violated the law by escaping before their victimizer could be charged. It is insane testing, but is it legal? Ethan asked the only question that mattered. Technically. Whitmore's mouth twisted. The Anti-Peonage Act makes it illegal to hold workers against their will, but it also contains provisions about contract fulfillment. A creative prosecutor could argue that leaving employment before completing a contract violates those provisions, especially if the employer claims he was denied the chance to address grievances through proper channels. So they found a way to make us criminals for escaping. Alina felt cold fury spreading through her chest. They turned survival into a crime. The warrant gave them 72 hours to surrender to federal authorities in Albuquerque. Failing to comply would result in additional charges and the issuance of fugitive warrants that would make them hunted across the entire territory. Margaret threw the papers across the room. This is Voss buying himself a federal magistrate. This is corruption so blatant, It would be funny if it was not trying to destroy you. Can we fight it? Mika's voice stayed level, not easily. Federal warrants are harder to challenge than territorial ones. We would need to file an emergency appeal, get a sympathetic judge to issue a stay, and then win the actual hearing on the merits. That is a lot of things that need to go right. How long would it take? Weeks at minimum. Months more likely. We do not have months. Alina stood and began pacing. 72 hours. 3 days to either surrender or become fugitives again. There is another option. Chavez had been quiet through most of the discussion. Now he spoke up with obvious reluctance. You could go to the Apache reservation. Claim sanctuary there. Federal authorities have limited jurisdiction on reservation land, and the tribal leadership has already indicated support for you. That is running. Nara shook her head. That is giving up everything we fought for. That is staying alive and free, Chavez countered. You can continue fighting from the reservation. Build your case. Wait for the political situation to shift. But you cannot fight if you are in federal custody being transferred between jurisdictions while Voss's lawyers file motion after motion to delay any actual trial. He is right, Margaret said quietly. Much as I hate to admit it, surrender right now means disappearing into the legal system. You could be held for months waiting for trial dates that keep getting postponed. Meanwhile, Voss controls the narrative, and your supporters lose momentum. So we run again. Alina heard defeat in her own voice. After everything, after going public and building support and making people care, we just run. You regroup. Ethan spoke with quiet intensity. You survived to fight another day when the odds are less rigged against you. There is no shame in that, but there is no victory either. Mika stood and walked to the window, just endless running from one temporary sanctuary to another. The room fell silent. They had reached the moment where all their planning and effort collapsed against the reality of how thoroughly the system was stacked against them. They could surrender and disappear. They could run and survive, but they could not win. Not right now. Not with the legal machinery turned so completely toward their destruction. Alina looked at her sisters, saw the same exhaustion and frustration reflected in their faces. They had been so close, had built momentum and support in a case that should have been enough. But should have been meant nothing when power and corruption aligned to crush you. We go to the reservation. She made the decision because someone had to. We regroup. We keep fighting, but we do it from a position where they cannot just lock us up and throw away the key. Nara looked like she wanted to argue. Mika simply nodded, accepting the necessity even as it burned. Ethan's face went carefully blank, but Elena saw something crack behind his eyes. When? Margaret asked. Tonight. No point waiting. 72 hours will pass whether we use them or not. I will arrange transport. Chavez stood. I know people who can get you there safely. Preparations moved quickly after that. Margaret sent word to the Apache tribal leadership that the sisters would be arriving seeking sanctuary. Chavez arranged for 2 trusted riders to serve as guides and guards. Whitmore drew up legal documents asserting their right to tribal protection under treaty obligations. As evening approached, Alina found herself on the porch watching the sun sink toward the western hills. Ethan joined her there, the two of them standing in silence that felt weighted with everything they had not said. You know you could come with us, Alina spoke without looking at him. The reservation would welcome you. You have done enough for us to earn that. This is my home. Ethan gestured at the land around them. My wife is buried under that cottonwood. My daughter beside her. I can't abandon them. They would understand. Maybe. But I would not. Elena understood. Everyone had their own anchors, the things they could not let go of, even when letting go might save them. For Ethan, it was this patch of earth and the memories buried in it. What will you do? She finally looked at him. When we are gone and Voss realizes we slipped away. Keep fighting. He met her gaze. Just because you are not here does not mean the case goes away. Margaret and Chavez and Whitmore will keep pushing. The story will keep spreading. And maybe eventually the system will care enough to act. That is optimistic. I have learned to take optimism where I can find it. They stood together as the stars began to emerge. When it was time to go, Alina gripped his hand briefly, felt the calluses and strength there. Then she turned and walked to where her sisters waited by the horses Chavez had brought. Mika was the last to mount up. She lingered by Ethan, her hand on his arm, her face tilted up to look at him in the darkness. Words passed between them too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then she kissed him brief and fierce before pulling away and climbing into her saddle. They rode north as the moon rose full and bright. Behind them the homestead grew smaller until it disappeared entirely into the darkness. Ahead lay the reservation and uncertain sanctuary. Around them rode Chavez and his two trusted men, forming a protective circle. Elena looked back only once, saw the lights of Haven Ridge glowing on the western horizon. Somewhere in that town or beyond it, Clayton Voss was probably learning that his latest legal maneuver had failed to trap them. He would be angry, would double his efforts, would find new ways to make their lives impossible. But tonight they were free, moving under their own power, making their own choices, still fighting even if the fight had taken a form they had not wanted. The battle was not over. It had simply moved to new ground. The reservation boundary was marked by a cairn of stones and a weathered sign. As they crossed it, Elena felt something shift. Not safety exactly, but a different kind of danger. The kind where at least the rules were known and the people around you shared your history and understood what was at stake. An Apache elder met them at the boundary. He spoke in their language, welcoming them home. The word hit Elena hard. Home. She had not thought of any place as home since her father died. But here, surrounded by people who looked like her and spoke her language and understood what it meant to survive systems designed to erase you, she felt something close to belonging. They were given a cabin on the edge of the settlement, small but clean with room for all three of them. That first night they slept deeply for the first time in weeks, exhaustion finally overwhelming the constant vigilance that had defined their existence since fleeing the labor camp. Morning brought a council meeting. The tribal leadership wanted to hear their story directly to understand what they were offering sanctuary to and what repercussions might follow. Elena told it plainly, holding back nothing. The labor camp, the abuses, Marcus Hale's death, the flight to Ethan's homestead, the legal battles that had driven them here. When she finished, the eldest council member spoke. "You have made powerful enemies. Your presence here will bring pressure on us. Federal authorities will demand we turn you over. They will threaten our treaty rights, our access to resources. Are you prepared for what your survival might cost your people?" The question hit like a physical blow. Elena had not fully considered that their sanctuary might come at someone else's expense. She looked at her sisters, saw the same realization dawning on their faces. "We can leave," Nara spoke up. "If our being here causes problems, we can go elsewhere." "No," the elder raised his hand. "I ask not to shame you, but to ensure you understand the stakes. Your fight is not just about 3 women anymore. It is about whether Apache people have the right to defend themselves against abuse, whether treaties mean anything, whether justice exists for us at all. Those are questions worth fighting for, even if the fight is hard." Relief and responsibility warred in Elena's chest. They had sanctuary, but it came with the weight of representing something larger than themselves. Every decision they made now would impact people beyond just the 3 of them. The days that followed established new routines. The sisters worked alongside other reservation residents, contributing to the community that had taken them in. News filtered in from outside. Margaret sent regular updates on the legal situation. Voss had been furious when he learned they had escaped to the reservation. He was pressuring federal officials to force their extradition, using every political connection he had. But something else was happening too. The story of 3 Apache women standing against a corrupt labor system had captured public imagination in ways that transcended the specific details. Reform candidates built campaigns around it. Newspapers editorialized. Churches preached sermons about justice and mercy. The sisters had become symbols, whether they wanted to be or not. 3 weeks into their reservation, a rider arrived with unexpected news. Federal Marshal Quinn, one Ethan had mentioned who seemed interested in actual justice, had reopened the investigation into labor camps across the territory. He was issuing subpoenas, demanding testimony, building a case that went far beyond just Voss's operation. Moreover, Judge Helena Marks had moved up her circuit schedule specifically to hear their case. She would arrive in 2 months to preside over what she was calling a comprehensive review of labor practices and treaty obligations. It was not the immediate justice they wanted, but it was something. It was the system finally grudgingly paying attention. Elena read the letter 3 times, trying to let hope take root, despite everything that had taught her hope was dangerous. Mika stood beside her, equally stunned. 2 months. Nara's voice carried disbelief. 2 months and we might actually get a fair hearing. Or 2 months for Voss to consolidate his position and buy more influence. Alina could not let herself fully believe, not yet. But in the quiet moments when she let her guard down, she felt something shifting. They had survived. They had found allies. They had made enough noise that the system could no longer simply ignore them. Whether that would translate to actual justice remained uncertain. What she knew for sure was that they were not running anymore. They were dug in, surrounded by community, preparing for the next phase of a fight that had already cost them so much. And somewhere out there in a homestead that had briefly felt like home, a man with his own ghosts was fighting alongside them, even in their absence. The battle was far from over. But for the first time since they fled that labor camp, Alina believed they might actually survive it. The 2 months before Judge Marks's arrival stretched and compressed like time viewed through warped glass. Each day on the reservation brought small victories and constant reminders of what still hung in the balance. Alina worked in the community gardens, her hands learning the rhythm of cultivation after years of exploitation. Nara taught English to younger children, finding purpose in passing knowledge forward. Mika spent hours with the tribal healers, learning traditional medicine that worked on wounds deeper than those visible on skin. But underneath the surface of daily life, preparation for the hearing consumed them. Whitmore visited weekly, coaching them on testimony and courtroom procedure. Chavez coordinated with other former workers who had agreed to testify, building a network of voices that would be harder to dismiss than 3 Apache women speaking alone. Margaret worked political angles, ensuring that enough powerful people had staked their reputations on the outcome that backing down would cost them. Marshal Quinn proved to be everything Ethan had suggested and more. He arrived at the reservation in the 3rd week, a weathered man in his 50s, with eyes that had seen too much and still somehow maintained their capacity for outrage. He interviewed the sisters separately, his questions precise but not invasive, designed to build legal framework rather than exploit trauma for emotional impact. I have been investigating labor practices in this territory for 6 months. Quinn closed his notebook after Alina's interview. What I have found makes me ashamed to wear this badge. The system has been corrupted from the inside out. Men like Voss operate openly because they know the law will protect them instead of their victims. Can you stop him? Alina needed to know if this was more empty promises dressed up as official concern. I can build a case that makes ignoring the problem impossible. Quinn met her gaze. Whether that translates to actual prosecution depends on politics above my pay grade. But I promise you this, my report will document every violation in language so clear that anyone who reads it and does nothing becomes complicit. Sometimes shame is the only weapon that works against entrenched corruption. He left after 3 days of interviews, his saddlebags heavy with testimony and documentation. 2 weeks later, word filtered back that he had arrested 4 labor camp operators on federal charges. Voss was not among them, his political connections still providing some insulation, but his associates were falling and everyone knew his protection was eroding. The news brought grim satisfaction. Each arrest felt like validation that they had been right to fight, but it also brought increased danger. Voss knew the walls were closing in. Cornered animals were the most dangerous kind. The threat manifested 5 weeks before the hearing. A group of men attacked the reservation boundary, setting fire to storage buildings and taking shots at anyone who tried to stop them. They fled before tribal law enforcement could respond in force, leaving behind 3 buildings reduced to ash and a message painted on a surviving wall, "Justice for Marcus Hale." No one was killed, but 2 people were injured, and the community's sense of safety was shattered. Alina knew without being told that this was Voss's work. Not done by his own hand, probably with enough distance that he could deny involvement, but his fingerprints were all over the escalation. The tribal council met in emergency session. Arguments raged about whether the sisters' continued presence justified the risk to everyone else. Some council members argued for turning them over, cutting a deal that would protect the majority at the expense of 3. Others insisted that surrendering to terrorism would invite even worse. Alina listened to people debate her fate like she was a tactical problem to be solved rather than a person. The rational part of her understood their position. She and her sisters had brought violence to people who had already suffered more than their share. But the exhausted part, the part that had been running and fighting for months, wanted to scream that she had not asked for any of this. The eldest council member finally called for quiet. We do not trade our people for temporary peace. That is what colonizers have always wanted us to do. Divide ourselves, sacrifice some to save others, except that some Apache lives matter less than safety or convenience. We do not do that here. We stand together or we fall separately. The vote carried by 2/3 majority. The sisters would stay. The community would defend itself. And if Voss wanted to escalate further, he would learn that Apache people had survived worse than arson and assassination attempts. But the attack changed something fundamental. It made clear that this was no longer just a legal battle playing out in courtrooms and newspapers. It was becoming a shooting war, and shooting wars had a way of consuming everyone nearby. Ethan sent word 3 days after the attack. Margaret delivered his message personally, riding to the reservation despite the increased danger. He wants you to know he is coming to the hearing. Margaret's face was tight with worry. I tried to talk him out of it. Chavez tried. Even Whitmore pointed out that his testimony is not strictly necessary. He is coming anyway. Why? Mika asked, though Elena suspected she already knew. Because he says he made a promise to see this through. Because he thinks his presence as a white property owner might provide legitimacy you would not get otherwise. Margaret paused. Because he is in love with you and cannot stand the thought of you facing this alone. The last statement hung in the air. Mika's face did not change expression, but something flickered behind her eyes. Alina had suspected, but having it confirmed made it real in a way that complicated everything. That is foolish, Mika's voice stayed level. His coming puts him in danger for no tactical benefit. His testimony does not add anything we do not already have. Logic and love do not often coexist peacefully. Margaret pulled out another letter. He also asked me to give you this. Mika took the envelope but did not open it immediately. Only after Margaret left did she break the seal and read the single page inside. When she finished, she folded it carefully and tucked it away. Elena saw her sister's hands shaking slightly. What did he say? Nara asked gently. That some risks are worth taking. That staying safe while others fight is its own kind of death. Mika's voice caught. That he has already buried everyone he loves once and refuses to do it again by choosing cowardice. He is a fool. Yes. Mika smiled despite the tears tracking down her face. And I am a fool for caring that he is coming. The final weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. More threats arrived, anonymous letters promising death, crude messages about what would happen to Apache women who forgot their place. Each one was documented, added to the growing pile of evidence that this was about more than just contract disputes. Whitmore arrived 10 days before the hearing with news that shifted the entire landscape. Judge Marks had not just moved up her schedule, she had converted the hearing into a formal grand jury proceeding with subpoena power. That meant witnesses could be compelled to testify under oath. Records could be seized. The entire scope of labor practices across the territory would be examined, not just the specific case of 3 women and Clayton Voss. This is what we hoped for. Whitmore's excitement was barely contained. A comprehensive review with actual legal authority behind it. If Marks follows through, she could expose the entire system. If Alina had learned to distrust optimism, what stops her from being bought or intimidated like everyone else? Her reputation. Margaret had come with Whitmore for this final strategy session. Helena Marks is 73 years old and does not give a damn about politics or popularity. She has presided over 3 of the most controversial cases in territorial history and never wavered. If anyone will give you a fair hearing, it is her. But fair does not mean favorable. Chavez spread documents across the table. Voss has resources we do not. He can afford better lawyers, expert witnesses, investigators who will find ways to undermine testimony. Even with a fair judge, we are fighting uphill. Then we need something that shifts the terrain entirely. Nara had been quiet through most of the meeting. Now she leaned forward. What if we do not just defend ourselves? What if we go on offense? Make Voss defend his entire operation, every decision, every contract, every act of violence. How? Whitmore asked. By turning this into an investigation of him instead of a trial of us. If we can force him to answer questions under oath about his camp, about his business practices, about what happened to other workers, then we control the narrative. We make him the one on trial. That is risky. Margaret looked troubled. If you push too hard and cannot prove allegations, it could backfire. make you look vindictive instead of victimized. Everything about this is risky. Mika spoke with quiet intensity. At least this way we fight actively instead of passively, hoping justice happens to us. The strategy was adopted. Whitmore began drafting a counter-complaint that would turn the hearing into a mutual examination. Chavez reached out to every former worker he could locate, building a chorus of voices. Margaret worked media contacts, ensuring that the hearing would be covered by newspapers across the territory. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave for the courthouse, a rider arrived with a telegram that changed everything again. Marshal Quinn had arrested Clayton Voss on federal charges of forced labor conspiracy to defraud and obstruction of justice. He was in custody pending trial, his bail set so high that even his considerable resources could not meet it. He is in jail. Nara read the telegram 3 times as if the words might rearrange themselves. Voss is actually in jail. For now. Chavez tempered the celebration. His lawyers are already filing motions for bail. But Quinn was smart. He timed the arrest to coincide with seizure of Voss's assets as evidence. Bank accounts frozen. Property liens filed. Everything tied up in the federal case. So he cannot make bail. Alina felt hope stirring despite her caution. Not easily. Margaret had received the same telegram. Quinn set bail at $50,000 cash. With Voss's liquid assets frozen pending the fraud investigation, he would need someone to front that money. And right now, every business associate of his is running for cover. No one wants to be seen helping a man arrested on the slavery charges. It changes more than optics. Alina felt something unlock in her chest. If he is defending himself against federal charges, he cannot simultaneously prosecute us. The legal shield he had been hiding behind just collapsed. Do not celebrate too early. Margaret's caution was well earned. Men like Voss do not go down easy. He will have contingencies. Allies who owe him favors. Ways to strike even from custody. She was right, of course. But for one brief moment, Alina let herself feel something close to hope. The journey to the courthouse took 2 days. They traveled in a group of 15, enough Apache community members to provide security and show solidarity. Ethan met them on the outskirts of town, his homestead visible in the distance. He looked thinner than Elena remembered, worn down by months of fighting on multiple fronts. But when Mika dismounted and approached him, the exhaustion fell away. They stood close together, not quite touching, saying things with their bodies that words would have made too definite. Finally, Ethan reached out and pulled her into an embrace that lasted long enough to make clear this was not casual affection, but something that had been building since the night 3 desperate women stumbled into his life. The courthouse was a squat adobe building that had been territorial property before statehood discussions began. It dominated the town square, imposing in its authority, if not its architecture. A crowd had gathered outside, split roughly between those wearing support ribbons in solidarity with the sisters and those carrying signs demanding justice for Marcus Hale. Judge Marks presided from a bench that elevated her above everyone else. She was exactly as Margaret had described, elderly, sharp-eyed, and radiating an authority that needed no enforcement because everyone in the room understood she would brook no nonsense. She surveyed the packed courtroom with the expression of a woman who had seen every legal trick and was prepared to crush any attempt to waste her time. This proceeding will examine labor practices at the Clayton Voss operation and related enterprises. Her voice carried despite her age. We will hear testimony from multiple witnesses. We will review documentation, and we will determine whether laws were broken and by whom. I expect cooperation from all parties. Anyone who attempts to obstruct or mislead this court will face immediate sanction. She gestured to the prosecution table where Voss sat in shackles beside his lawyer, an expensive-looking man from Santa Fe, who clearly resented being stuck in what he probably viewed as a backwater territorial dispute. Then she gestured to the defense table where the 3 sisters sat with Whitmore. Let us begin. The first day consisted mainly of procedural matters and opening statements. Voss's lawyer painted his client as a legitimate businessman, victimized by disgruntled workers and political rivals. He claimed the labor camp operated within all legal guidelines, that contracts were fairly negotiated, that Marcus Hale's death was unprovoked murder. Whitmore's response was surgical. He outlined not just what happened to the 3 sisters, but the systematic pattern of abuse that characterized Voss's entire operation. He promised documentation testimony from multiple sources and evidence that would prove Voss had built his fortune on the backs of workers he treated as disposable property. By day's end, the courtroom had gone silent. Even those who had arrived sympathetic to Voss looked troubled. The allegations were too specific, too well documented, to dismiss as lies or exaggeration. Day 2 brought witnesses. Chavez testified, first describing his investigation as deputy territorial marshal and why he had ultimately resigned. His quiet dignity and obvious competence made him impossible to dismiss as biased or unreliable. He presented records of complaints he had filed, requests for investigation he had submitted, and the pattern of obstruction he had encountered from officials who should have pursued justice. Then came former workers. 6 of them, one after another, describing conditions at Voss's camp that matched everything the sisters had reported. The courtroom listened to testimony about wages withheld, violence overlooked, and contracts extended through fraudulent charges. By the 4th witness, even the judge looked grim. Voss's lawyer tried to undermine each witness through cross-examination. He implied they were lying for revenge or had been coached by the sisters' legal team. But the consistency of their accounts made such arguments ring hollow. 6 people from different backgrounds interviewed separately, all telling the same essential story. The mathematical probability of coordination approached 0. Day 3 was when Alina testified. She took the stand knowing everything depended on how she presented, how she held herself under questioning. Whitmore walked her through events carefully. The promises that brought them to Voss's camp, the reality they discovered, the escalating abuses, the night Nara was attacked and Elena killed Marcus Hale. Tell the court exactly what you saw when you entered that room. Whitmore's voice was gentle but firm. Elena took a breath, forced herself to look at the judge instead of at Voss sitting 20 feet away. I saw my sister on the ground. I saw Marcus Hale holding her down. I saw his hand covering her mouth and his other hand. She stopped, composed herself. His other hand was working at his belt. There was no question what he intended. No ambiguity about what was happening. What did you do? I grabbed the knife from where it had fallen during the struggle. I crossed the space between us, and I cut his throat before he could finish what he was starting. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the spectators seemed to be holding their breath. Do you regret killing him? Whitmore asked. Alina met his eyes. I regret that my sister had to experience what she experienced before I stopped it. I regret that the world is such that men like Marcus Hale exist. But do I regret stopping him the only way available to me? No, I do not regret that. Voss's lawyer tried to shake her testimony during cross-examination. He implied she had killed Hale for reasons having nothing to do with protecting her sister. He suggested anger over working conditions, revenge for other grievances, cold-blooded murder dressed up as defense. Elena remained steady through all of it. Yes, she was angry about working conditions. Yes, she resented being lied to and exploited. But none of that changed what happened in that room. None of that made Marcus Hale any less of a rapist or her actions any less justified. When she stepped down, she felt hollowed out, but also cleansed. She had told the truth under oath. Whatever happened next, at least the official record would contain her actual account rather than whatever lies Voss had been spreading. Mika testified next, describing her injuries and the medical neglect that characterized the camp. Then Nara forcing herself to recount the assault in detail that made several spectators leave the courtroom in tears. Each sister's testimony built on the others, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse. Day 4 brought Ethan to the stand. He described finding the sisters, his decision to help them, the confrontation with Voss. His testimony mattered not because it added new facts, but because it came from a white property owner who had no obvious reason to lie. His credibility helped legitimize accounts that some might have dismissed if they came only from Apache women. Under cross-examination, Voss's lawyer tried to suggest Ethan had romantic involvement with the sisters and was therefore biased. Ethan did not deny the attachment. I care about them. His voice was steady. That does not mean I am lying. It means I have spent months watching them fight for justice while the system tried to crush them. Any person with a conscience would care. Any person with a soul would want to help. The lawyer switched tactics, suggesting Ethan's testimony was tainted by grief over his dead wife and daughter, that he was projecting his own loss onto the sisters' situation. Ethan's face went cold. My wife spent years documenting the exact kind of abuses these women experienced. She died before she could bring that documentation to anyone who would act on it. If you think grief makes me less reliable, you are wrong. It makes me more determined to finish what she started. It makes me unwilling to let her work be wasted or her death be meaningless. The lawyer had no effective response to that. He sat down looking frustrated. Day 5 began with the prosecution's key move, calling Clayton Voss himself to testify. His lawyer objected strenuously, arguing that forcing a defendant to testify in his own grand jury proceeding violated his Fifth Amendment rights. Judge Marks overruled him. This is a grand jury investigation, not a criminal trial. Marks's tone brooked no argument. Mr. Voss will answer questions about his business practices. He may invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege on specific questions if he chooses, but blanket refusal to testify is not acceptable. Voss took the stand looking like a man who knew his empire was crumbling. Whitmore questioned him methodically, forcing him to either confirm damning facts or invoke the Fifth Amendment dozens of times. Each invocation looked like an admission of guilt. Did you use forged documents to extend worker contracts beyond agreed terms? I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege. Did you maintain workers in conditions you knew were unsafe and unsanitary? I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege. Did you or your employees use physical violence to prevent workers from leaving your camp? I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege. After 20 minutes of this, even his own lawyer looked defeated. Voss's refusal to answer was probably legally sound, but it destroyed any remaining credibility. He looked guilty because he was guilty, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But then Whitmore asked a question Voss apparently could not resist answering. Did Marcus Hale, your employee, have a history of sexual assault against workers at your camp? Voss leaned forward, his face flushing. Marcus Hale was a good man, doing a difficult job. Those women. He gestured toward the sisters. They seduced him, tempted him, then killed him when he did not give them what they wanted. That is the truth no one wants to hear. The courtroom erupted. Judge Marks hammered her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Whitmore looked shocked at getting Voss to actually admit to victim blaming on the record. And the sisters sat frozen, hearing once again the ancient lie that women are responsible for violence done to them. Order, Marks's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Voss, you will confine yourself to answering questions asked, not offering commentary. But the damage was done. Voss had revealed himself in that moment, shown the contempt and entitlement that underlay his entire operation. Even spectators who had been sympathetic to him looked disgusted. The prosecution rested after Voss stepped down. The defense called a few character witnesses for Voss people who claimed he was an upstanding member of the community. Their testimony rang hollow against the weight of evidence already presented. Closing arguments happened on day 6. Voss's lawyer made a final attempt to portray his client as a victim of changing times and political persecution. He argued that labor camps were common throughout the territory, that Voss had simply operated within accepted norms, that singling him out was unfair. Whitmore's closing was devastating in its simplicity. He walked the judge through the evidence step by step, the contracts that misrepresented terms, the wages never paid, the violence systematically overlooked, the workers held against their will, and finally the attempted rape that precipitated everything else. This is not about changing norms or political persecution. Whitmore faced the judge directly. This is about a man who built wealth by treating human beings as property, about a system that enabled him to do so with impunity, about 3 women who said no and paid a terrible price for that refusal. The only question before this court is whether justice still means anything or whether power and money can continue buying immunity from consequence. He sat down. The courtroom was silent. Judge Marks adjourned for the day, promising a ruling the following morning. That night, the sisters and their supporters gathered in a hotel that Margaret had secured. No one could eat, no one could celebrate or mourn because they did not yet know which would be appropriate. They simply waited, suspended between possibilities. Ethan found Mika on the hotel balcony staring out at the dark town. She did not turn when he approached, but her posture changed slightly, acknowledging his presence. Whatever happens tomorrow, we will face it. His voice was quiet. Together. You should not have come. Mika still would not look at him. If Voss's people decide to retaliate, you are now a target. I became a target the moment I drew water for 3 strangers. He moved closer, and I would do it again. Every part of it? Why? Mika finally turned. Why would you risk everything for us? We are not your family. not your responsibility. We are complications that could cost you everything you have left. Because loving someone is always a complication. Because keeping yourself safe and apart is not living, it is just waiting to die. Because my wife would be ashamed of me if I turned away from people who needed help. Your wife is dead. Mika's voice broke on the words. You owe her nothing except grief. I owe her the promise that her work will mean something, that the documentation she gathered and the justice she fought for will not end with her. Ethan reached out and took Mika's hand. And maybe I owe myself the chance to feel something again besides emptiness. They stood together in the darkness, two people who had found each other through circumstance and stayed together through choice. Whatever tomorrow brought, this moment existed, this connection, this defiance of loneliness in a world that tried to isolate and break them. Judge Marks delivered her ruling at 10 the following morning. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and pressing against walls. The judge surveyed them all with her usual severity before beginning to read. After reviewing 6 days of testimony and examining extensive documentation, this court finds the following. 1. Clayton Voss operated a labor camp that systematically violated federal statutes prohibiting forced labor and debt bondage. 2 workers at this camp were held against their will through fraud, intimidation, and violence. 3 wages were consistently withheld through false claims and accounting irregularities. She paused. Let her gaze sweep across Voss and his lawyer. 4. Marcus Hale, an employee of Mr. Voss, had documented a history of sexual assault against workers that was known to management and deliberately overlooked. 5. On the night in question, Marcus Hale attempted to rape Nara So. 6. Alina So used reasonable force to stop an ongoing felony assault. The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Alina felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Therefore, this court finds no basis for criminal charges against Alina So, Mika So, or Nara So. The killing of Marcus Hale was justifiable homicide in defense of another person. The flight from Voss's camp was not breach of contract, but escape from illegal detention. Relief crashed through Alina like a wave. Beside her, Nara started crying. Mika closed her eyes and exhaled a breath she might have been holding for months. Furthermore, Marks was not finished. This court recommends immediate federal prosecution of Clayton Voss on multiple charges. This court recommends investigation of all labor camps operating in the territory. This court recommends new legislation to prevent the kind of systematic abuse documented in this proceeding. She looked directly at the 3 sisters. You are free to go. With the court's apologies that justice took so long to find you. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted in cheers and outrage depending on which side people had chosen. Voss's lawyer was already gathering his papers, preparing appeals that everyone knew would fail. Voss himself sat defeated, his face gray, looking like a man watching his entire world collapse. The sisters stood together, holding each other while people surged around them. They had won. Actually won. Not just survived, but achieved actual legal victory that would stand an official record. Alina felt like she was floating untethered from the certainty of injustice that had defined her existence for so long. Outside the courthouse, Catherine Price was already writing her story. Margaret was fielding questions from territorial officials who suddenly wanted to be associated with reform. Chavez stood with the other Apache community members, his face showing satisfaction at finally seeing the system work the way it was supposed to. Ethan waited on the courthouse steps. When Mika emerged, she walked straight to him and let him fold her into an embrace. Around them, people cheered or took photographs or simply watched this moment of connection between 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate tragedies. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and the immediate chaos had settled, the sisters sat together in the hotel room trying to process what had happened. They were free. The word felt strange, heavy with possibility. What do we do now? Nara asked the question they were all thinking. Where do we go? Wherever we choose. Alina felt the weight of that truth. For the first time in years, we have actual choice. A messenger from the tribal council arrived the next morning. The eldest council member had sent word they wanted Alina to return to the reservation, not just as a resident, but as a leader. They are asking you to join the council. Margaret translated the formal letter. To help lead negotiations with territorial authorities. Your father held a seat before he died. They want you to take his place. Alina felt the weight of that request settle on her shoulders. Her father had been a respected voice, someone who understood both Apache traditions and the encroaching white world. Taking his seat would mean responsibility, not just for herself and her sisters, but for hundreds of people navigating impossible choices. I cannot. The words came out before she could stop them. I am not my father. I do not have his wisdom. You have something he did not. Nara spoke quietly. You have survived what he could not protect us from. You know what happens when we have no one to speak for us in their halls of power. But if I go back to the reservation to lead, what happens to you two? Elena looked between her sisters. Do I abandon you to serve the community? You would not be abandoning us. Mika's voice was firm. You would be doing what you were meant to do, what we fought for the right to choose. The choice hung there heavy with implications. Leadership meant sacrifice. It always had. I need time, Elena said finally. Time to think about what kind of leader I could be, what kind I want to be. The council can wait. Margaret folded the letter. They have waited this long. A few more weeks will not matter. The reservation wants us to come back. Mika spoke carefully. They have offered housing, work, community. But, Alina heard the hesitation. But Ethan's homestead is standing empty, and he has asked if we might consider. Mika stopped. She could not quite finish the thought. Consider staying with him. Nara completed it. Building something together. Is that what you want? Alina studied her sister's face. I do not know what I want except to stop running. To have time to figure out who I am when I am not just surviving. Mika looked at both her sisters. But I know I cannot do that while also worrying you two feel abandoned. We would not feel abandoned. Nara's voice was firm. We would feel happy that you found something worth staying for. What about you two? Mika asked. What do you want? Alina considered the question seriously. The reservation offered community and safety. Ethan's homestead offered something different, the chance to build something new to create rather than just recover. Both had merit. Both had risks. Maybe we do not have to choose only one thing. She spoke slowly, working through the idea as she articulated it. Maybe Nara and I spend part of our time on the reservation maintaining connections there, and part of our time at the homestead helping build something. We do not have to fit into only one box anymore, a hybrid existence. Nara considered it, Apache and American, traditional and new, connected to community but also forging our own path. Why not? Mika smiled. We have already broken every expectation anyone had for us. Might as well keep defying categories. The three of them sat together as the evening light painted the hotel walls gold. They had fought and survived and won. Now came the harder part, figuring out how to live with freedom, how to build lives that honored what they had endured while not being defined solely by suffering. A week later, they returned to Ethan's homestead. The ride there felt different from their first desperate approach. Openly, legally, with nothing to fear except the normal uncertainties that defined any life. The land stretched around them, harsh and beautiful, full of possibility. Ethan met them at the property line. His homestead looked different too, like the grief that had saturated it had finally begun to lift. He had planted new crops, repaired the barn, built an additional room onto the house. Small changes that suggested hope was taking root. That first evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset over the valley. The silence was comfortable, companionable, the silence of people who understood each other's wounds and had chosen to bear them together. I have been thinking, Ethan spoke into the quiet, about what comes next, for all of us. Tell us. Mika leaned against his shoulder. The reservation needs a liaison with the outside world, someone who understands both Apache ways and the legal systems that keep encroaching. Margaret suggested we could create a formal position, someone to advocate, coordinate with territorial officials, help navigate bureaucracy. He looked at Alina. She is good at standing up to power, at refusing to back down. Those are the exact skills needed. Alina felt surprise and something else. Recognition that someone saw her, clearly saw her strengths rather than just her damage. You want me to be an advocate. I want you to consider it. The reservation wants it. Margaret has funding secured. You would have actual authority, actual ability to make change instead of just surviving change. And Nara, Mika asked, what about her? The Territorial Board of Education is starting a program to improve literacy on reservations. Ethan turned to the youngest sister. They need teachers who speak both languages, who understand both worlds. They specifically asked about you after the trial publicity, so we would all have purpose. Nara spoke slowly. Not just survival, but actual meaningful work. If you want it, Ethan was careful not to push. This is not obligation, not payment for what you have been through. Just recognition that you have skills this territory needs and the courage to use them in service of something larger. The sisters looked at each other, saw in each other's faces the same mix of uncertainty and excitement. For so long, they had been defined by what was done to them, by trauma and injustice, and the fight to survive. Now they were being offered the chance to be defined by what they chose to do, by the work they selected and the purposes they served. 1 month after the trial, Clayton Voss was convicted on 14 federal charges and sentenced to 25 years. His labor camp was dismantled. The workers freed the land sold to pay restitution. 6 months after that, new territorial legislation passed establishing labor oversight and penalties for contract fraud. It was imperfect law, but it was change. A year after they first stumbled onto Ethan's land, the three sisters had each found their path. Elena negotiated treaty obligations from a territorial office wearing both Apache dress and legal authority. Nara taught English in a reservation schoolhouse, giving children tools their parents had lacked. And Mika remained at the homestead with Ethan, building a partnership that defied easy categorization. Not quite Apache, not quite white, but their own creation entirely. Some mornings she woke from nightmares about Marcus Hale, but more mornings she woke thinking about lesson plans and the difference education could make. And Mika remained at the homestead with Ethan, the two of them building something that defied easy categorization. Not quite Apache, not quite white, but its own thing, a partnership forged in crisis and sustained through mutual respect. They worked the land together, hosted community gatherings, and slowly transformed a place that had been a tomb into something alive again. On the first anniversary of Judge Marks's ruling, the three sisters gathered at the homestead for dinner. It had become their ritual, this monthly coming together, to maintain bonds that distance and separate work might otherwise strain. They cooked together, combining traditional Apache dishes with the practical frontier cooking Ethan had mastered during his years alone. After the meal, they sat on the porch as stars emerged overhead. The land around them held its breath in the way it did on clear nights, everything still and watchful. "Do you ever think about Marcus Hale?" Nara asked the question none of them had spoken aloud in months. "About what I lost when he attacked me. What we all lost, every day." Elena answered honestly. "I think about how different our lives would be if I had hesitated even 1 second longer, if I had doubted my right to stop him. But we cannot live in what-ifs." Mika spoke with the certainty that came from having found purpose beyond trauma. "We can only live in what is. And what is right now is that we survived. We fought. We won. And we are using that victory to build something that matters." I wanted to hate him forever. Nara's voice was quiet, to carry that rage like a weapon. "But I am tired of being defined by what he tried to do to me. I want to be defined by what I chose to do after." The three of them sat together as the night deepened. They had traveled so far from that desperate morning when they collapsed at Ethan's well, not just in miles, but in becoming. They had been victims who became survivors, who became advocates, had been prey who became predators, who became protectors. Their story had spread throughout the territory in the years since the trial. Three Apache women versus the system. It was told in different ways depending on who did the telling. Some made them into martyrs, tragic figures who suffered nobly. Others made them into revolutionaries, warriors fighting oppression. A few even made them into villains, lawbreakers who got lucky. But none of those versions captured the whole truth, because the truth was messier than any narrative. They were neither martyrs, nor warriors, nor villains. They were just women who refused to accept that their suffering was inevitable, who found allies in unexpected places, who fought with whatever weapons were available, and somehow against impossible odds won. Ethan joined them on the porch carrying coffee that steamed in the cooling air. He settled beside Mika, his presence a reminder that their victory had not been theirs alone. That justice, when it finally came through networks of people who chose solidarity over safety. Marshal Quinn is riding circuit again. He spoke into the comfortable silence, investigating labor operations throughout the territory. He has already arrested 4 more operators. Says your case gave him the framework to pursue charges that were always theoretically illegal but practically ignored. So we changed things, Nara sounded surprised. Actually changed policy, not just our own situation. You forced the system to acknowledge its own rules, Ethan corrected gently. Made it too expensive to keep looking away. That is how change happens. Not through grand declarations, but through specific cases that make injustice too visible to ignore. Margaret arrived the next morning with news that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Two territorial representatives wanted to meet with Alina about running for office. They believed a voice like hers, someone who understood both Apache concerns and territorial politics, could win in a newly created district. Absolutely not. Alina's response was immediate. I barely understand how to advocate without constantly fighting. The idea of becoming a politician, of having to compromise and negotiate and play games, that is not who I am. Maybe that is exactly why you should consider it. Margaret did not push, just presented the option. The territory is changing. Your case accelerated that change. Someone needs to be in the room when decisions get made, someone who remembers what it costs when the system fails people. I will think about it, Alina conceded, but do not expect me to suddenly become diplomatic. I would not dare. Margaret smiled. Your lack of diplomacy is exactly what makes you effective. Time continued its forward march. Seasons changed. The homestead that had been Ethan's lonely refuge became a gathering place for people working toward justice across the territory. Former workers found their way there seeking advice or just connection with others who understood what surviving meant. Advocates and reformers made pilgrimages to meet the women whose story had become legend. Through it all, the three sisters maintained their rhythm of coming together and moving apart. They had learned that surviving trauma meant allowing space for each person to heal at their own pace in their own way. Sometimes that meant distance. Sometimes it meant fierce closeness. Always it meant trust that the bond between them could withstand whatever strain individual growth required. On a clear morning, 2 years after Judge Marks's ruling, Catherine Price returned to interview them for a follow-up story. She wanted to know how their lives had changed, what lessons they carried forward, what they would say to others facing similar situations. They sat together in Ethan's parlor, the same room where they had once hidden from men who thought they owned them. Now it felt like a sanctuary by choice rather than necessity. What sustained you, Catherine asked. Through the darkest moments. What kept you fighting when the system was doing everything possible to crush you? The three sisters looked at each other. Then Alina spoke. Each other. Knowing that we were not alone, that we had witnesses to what happened who would not let the truth be buried. Everything else, the allies we found, the lawyers and advocates and people who helped, all of that came after. But first there was just us refusing to let each other disappear. And now, Catherine pressed, what sustains you now that the immediate crisis has passed? Purpose, Mika answered. Knowing that what we endured was not meaningless, that it created change which helps others. That alone makes it bearable. Nara added her own perspective. Community, having people who understand that healing is not linear, who do not expect us to be either perpetually damaged or completely recovered, who let us be complicated. Catherine wrote it all down. Later, when the story published, it would become one of the most widely read pieces in territorial history. Not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. Because it showed that justice was possible even when systems were corrupt. That ordinary people could defeat powerful men if they refused to accept defeat. But the most important impact of their story was quieter, harder to measure. In labor camps across the territory, workers read about 3 women who said no and survived. In reservations and mining towns and farms, people saw that the system could be beaten. Not easily, not without cost, but beaten nonetheless. One evening, as Ethan and Mika sat on the porch watching another sunset paint the sky, impossible colors, she asked him the question that had been forming for months. Do you ever regret it, taking us in, everything that followed, every day? He answered honestly, and also never. That is a contradiction. It is the truth. He turned to look at her. I regret that you had to suffer, that the world is such that suffering was necessary. I regret every moment of fear and pain and uncertainty, but I do not regret knowing you. Do not regret becoming part of something larger than my own grief. The cost was terrible, but the alternative was worse. What alternative? staying safe and small, protecting my homestead and my solitude while the world ground people up around me. That would have been easier, but it also would have been death, just slower and quieter than a bullet. Mika leaned against him, feeling the solidity of his presence. They had built something together that neither of them had imagined possible 2 years ago. Not romance in any conventional sense, though. Love was certainly part of it, but something more fundamental, a partnership forged in crisis and refined through choice. The homestead had become more than just a building on claimed land. It was a statement, a defiance of expectations and categories, a place where Apache and white and every complex combination between could exist and build and thrive, where the past wounds were acknowledged but did not dictate the future's possibilities. 3 years after that first desperate dawn, Alina sat in the Territorial Assembly as a newly elected representative. She still dressed in traditional Apache clothing, still spoke with the blunt honesty that had served her in survival. But now she wielded institutional power, could write laws and demand accountability, and make the system serve justice instead of just enabling exploitation. Nara had opened her own school on the reservation, one that taught both languages and both histories, where children learned that being Apache did not mean rejecting everything the outside world offered, and accepting education did not mean abandoning their heritage. The balance was delicate but necessary. The world was not going to stop encroaching. The question was whether Apache people would have tools to navigate it on their own terms. And Mika remained at the homestead, though her work had expanded beyond farming. She coordinated support networks for survivors of labor abuse throughout the territory, provided resources and advocacy, made sure others had the help she and her sisters had desperately needed and nearly died waiting for. On the 5th anniversary of Judge Marks's ruling, the territorial governor issued a formal apology for the systemic failures that had enabled operations like Voss's to flourish. It was largely symbolic words without material compensation, but it was also acknowledgement. Recognition in official record that what happened had been wrong, that the territory bore responsibility, that change was necessary. The three sisters attended the ceremony together, stood side by side while the governor spoke words that came years too late to undo damage, but perhaps in time to prevent future repetition. Afterwards, reporters surrounded them, asking for reactions. Alina spoke for them all. Apologies mean nothing without action. Show us new oversight structures. Show us enforcement of existing laws. Show us that workers have real recourse when they are abused. Then maybe we can talk about forgiveness. It was vintage Alina refusing to let powerful people off easy, demanding substance over symbolism. The governor looked uncomfortable. The assembled politicians shifted nervously, but no one could argue with her, not after everything. That night, back at the homestead, they held their own quiet ceremony, not celebrating the apology or the attention or the symbolic victories, but marking survival, marking the 5 years they had lived past the moment when death or eternal subjugation had seemed inevitable. Ethan prepared dinner while the sisters sat together, remembering, not dwelling in trauma, but acknowledging it, honoring what they had endured and who it had required them to become. I have dreams sometimes, Nara spoke into the gathering dusk, where Marcus Hale is still alive, where Alina hesitated, where we never escaped. We all have those dreams. Mika took her sister's hand. They are not prophecy, just our minds trying to process what happened by imagining alternatives. I wake up from them grateful. Nara continued, grateful that you did not hesitate, grateful that Ethan drew that bucket of water, grateful for every person who chose to help when they could have looked away. The gratitude is almost as heavy as the trauma. Alina understood. Surviving created obligations. To honor the help received by helping others, to use privilege and platform earned through suffering to prevent others suffering. It was exhausting work, but it was also purpose, and purpose made the weight bearable. They ate together as stars emerged, talked about small things and large things and everything between, argued about politics and laughed about nothing, existed as themselves, complex and contradictory and whole. Later, as Alina prepared to ride back to her lodgings in town, Ethan walked her to her horse. They had developed an unexpected friendship in the years since the trial, these two people who had faced death together and survived to build something better. You know Margaret is right, Ethan spoke quietly. about you having potential for higher office, territorial senate, maybe even governor someday. Absolutely not. But Alina smiled as she said it. Why not? Because I am too angry, too willing to call powerful men on their nonsense, too Apache in a territory that is still not sure whether we deserve to exist, all of which are exactly why you should run. Elena mounted her horse, looked down at this man who had risked everything for three strangers and somehow become family. Maybe someday, but first I need to learn how to live without constantly fighting. Need to remember that I am more than my trauma and my anger. Fair enough. Ethan stepped back. But when you are ready, the territory will need you. She rode into the night back toward the town that was slowly becoming home. The journey that began with desperate flight had transformed into something else entirely. Not an ending because stories like theirs do not truly end, but a transition from victims to survivors to architects of change. Behind her at the homestead, Mika and Nara sat with Ethan watching the stars wheel overhead. They talked about nothing important, made plans for tomorrow and next month and years hence, existed in the present without the past devouring them or the future terrifying them. Later that night, Elena walked out to the well where it had all begun. The same well where Ethan had drawn water for three desperate strangers. She traced her fingers along the worn rope, feeling the grooves cut by years of use. Mika and Nara joined her without speaking. The three of them stood together in the moonlight, looking at the spot where their old lives had ended and something new had been born. Do you ever wish we could go back? Nara asked. To before all of this happened? No. Alina surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. I wish the world were different. I wish we had not had to suffer to survive. But going back would mean losing what we became. Mika dipped her hand into the bucket Ethan had left at the well's edge, the water catching starlight. We were not free then either. We just did not know it yet. And now, Nara pressed, now we know what freedom costs. Alina looked at her sisters, seeing in their faces the same scars and strengths she carried. And we know it is worth fighting for. They stood together as the night deepened, three women who had been broken and survived and rebuilt themselves into something stronger than what tried to destroy them. The bucket sat between them, half full of water that gleamed like silver in the darkness. It was not an ending. Their story would continue tomorrow and the day after, full of struggles they could not yet imagine. But tonight, in this moment, they were together. They were free. And that was enough.